It is no surprise that the diplomacy of the Byzantine Empire has long remained a difficult subject to fully capture. To understand it in its entirety would require following the empire's relationships across vast regions, stretching from Europe into Asia and deep into Africa. A few historians have tried to summarize this immense system, but most efforts have only scratched the surface. Because of this, anyone who wants to truly grasp Byzantine foreign policy must piece it together from scattered studies, individual reigns, and focused works on specific regions. Rather than attempting to explain everything at once, it makes more sense to observe Byzantine diplomacy in action, in a defined setting where real problems forced real decisions. By doing this, a clearer picture begins to emerge. One of the most important regions for understanding this system lies beyond the empire's northern borders. This was a vast and restless world stretching from the plains of Central Europe to the edges of the Caspian Sea, covering mountains, open steppes, and key river routes. It was not just a distant frontier, it was a constant source of pressure, opportunity, and danger. From this northern world came wave after wave of peoples: Huns, Bulgars, Avars, Slavs, Rus, and Pechenegs. Some came as raiders, others as settlers, and many eventually became both allies and enemies. For centuries, Byzantium stood as a barrier between these forces and the rest of Europe. But what is often overlooked is that this role was not maintained by military strength alone. It was diplomacy, carefully crafted, patient, and adaptive, that allowed the empire to survive where others might have fallen. The Byzantine approach was shaped by necessity. The empire faced threats on multiple fronts at all times. To the east, powerful empires and rising forces pushed toward its borders. To the north, mobile and unpredictable tribes constantly tested its defences. War was expensive, draining both resources and manpower. As a result, Byzantine leaders became masters of avoiding direct conflict whenever possible. They learned to influence, manipulate, and guide events beyond their borders instead of simply reacting to them. To manage this complex world, Byzantine diplomacy focused on key strategic zones. Three regions stood out as especially critical: the Caucasus, the Crimea, and the Danube. Each of these areas acted like a hinge, where the balance of power could shift in favour of the empire or against it. The Caucasus was one of the most vital regions. It formed a natural bridge between the Black Sea and the Caspian, and it was here that different worlds collided. Mediterranean civilization, nomadic steppe cultures, and the great powers of the Middle East. Whoever controlled or influenced this region could shape the movement of armies and trade routes. Byzantine strategy here was clear. Build a chain of allied or dependent states that would act as a protective barrier. Local peoples were encouraged to align themselves with the empire, often through diplomacy, religion, and economic ties. Many were converted to Christianity, which created a shared identity and strengthened loyalty. Roads, fortresses, and trade routes reinforced these connections, turning influence into something tangible. These alliances were not just defensive, they also allowed Byzantium to bypass its enemies economically. Trade routes passing through the Caucasus opened access to valuable goods, including silk, without relying on hostile powers. In this way, diplomacy and commerce worked together as tools of survival. Further north, the steppe regions beyond the Caucasus played a different but equally important role. These open lands acted as a highway for migrating tribes. Controlling or influencing the peoples who lived there meant controlling the flow of potential invaders. Byzantine leaders understood this early on and sought to support strong allies in the region. At times, entire kingdoms were raised with Byzantine backing, their rulers tied to Constantinople through personal relationships, titles, and shared interests. These alliances could be remarkably effective. Friendly powers acted as buffers, absorbing or redirecting threats before they reached the empire itself. The Crimea formed another crucial part of this system. It was more than just a distant outpost. It was a window into the northern world. From here, Byzantine officials could monitor the movements of tribes, gather intelligence, and intervene when necessary. The region also served as a hub of trade, linking the empire with distant lands through the exchange of goods like furs, salt, and raw materials. But its most important function was strategic. By maintaining a presence in the Crimea, Byzantium could apply one of its oldest and most effective methods, playing rival groups against each other. When unity among northern tribes threatened the empire, Byzantine diplomacy worked to divide them. When one group became too powerful, another was encouraged to rise against it. This constant balancing act required patience and precision. Alliances shifted, loyalties changed, and new powers emerged. For example, when older allies declined, Byzantium did not hesitate to form new partnerships. The rise of the Pechenegs in the steppe forced the empire to rethink its strategy. Instead of resisting them outright, Byzantine diplomacy brought them into its sphere of influence. Through gifts, agreements, and careful negotiation, they were turned into a stabilizing force. Their presence discouraged other enemies from advancing and helped secure trade routes. What emerges from all this is a clear pattern. Byzantine diplomacy was not about fixed alliances or simple agreements. It was about managing a constantly changing environment. The empire did not aim to dominate every region directly. Instead, it sought to shape the world around it, ensuring that no single power could become strong enough to threaten its survival. Another reason the Byzantine hold on Crimea became so important in this period was the rise of the Scandinavian warriors who moved south along the great rivers of Eastern Europe and helped build the early Russian principalities along the Dnieper route. From their bases in the north, and especially from Kiev, these new powers launched repeated attacks toward the Black Sea and even against Constantinople itself. Yet the Byzantines were not blind to these dangers. In Cherson, their officials watched the northern world with great care, gathering intelligence and warning the capital when fleets began to move. The city was not simply a remote outpost. It was a listening post, an early warning station, and one of the empire's sharpest diplomatic tools. When the Rus approached in large numbers, news could travel quickly from Crimea to Constantinople. That alone made Cherson worth defending. The rulers of Rus understood this well. They knew that as long as Cherson remained in Byzantine hands, the empire would never be truly exposed in the north. So they tried to eliminate this obstacle. For a brief moment, they succeeded. At the end of the 10th century, Vladimir of Rus captured Cherson. But in one of history's great reversals, the city that had been taken by force ended up transforming the conqueror himself. What began as a military seizure turned into a political and religious turning point. Vladimir married the emperor's sister, accepted Christianity, and returned the city. In that moment, Byzantium achieved something greater than a battlefield victory. Through diplomacy, religion, and prestige, it drew the vast lands of Rus into the orbit of Byzantine civilization. The empire did not merely recover a city. It gained the loyalty of a rising power and opened the way for an enormous cultural and spiritual expansion far beyond its own borders. The third great zone of pressure along Byzantium's northern frontier was the Danube. Unlike Crimea or the Caucasus, which served more as shields and strategic buffers, the Danube was a direct front line. It was the place where the dangers of the steppe most often broke into the Balkans. This was due to geography. The lower Danube stood near the end of the great grassland corridor that had carried wave after wave of nomadic peoples westward from Asia. If invaders passed through the traps, alliances, and defensive systems Byzantium had built farther east, they could reach the Danube and from there enter the Balkan lands. Constantinople itself, though magnificently protected from the sea, was never as secure on the landward side. Once enemies crossed into Thrace, the road toward the imperial capital became frighteningly open. This was the harsh reality Byzantine rulers faced for centuries. New enemies constantly appeared. When one threat faded, another rose in its place. Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars, Magyars, Pechenegs, Rus, and Cumans all pressed at one time or another against this frontier. Their attacks were not only military, they disrupted farming, trade, and settlement, exhausting the provinces and forcing the empire into an endless struggle for stability. The Balkans became the scene of some of Byzantium's hardest diplomatic and military battles, and nowhere was this challenge more sustained than in its long and complicated relationship with the Slavs. Here, the story is marked by repeated cycles of resistance, adaptation, loss, and recovery. Byzantine rulers tried many methods. Some sought to defend the Danube through a complex system of alliances and strategic balancing. Others attempted to meet the threat with military force and frontier warfare. At times, they won impressive victories, but no success was ever final. Slavic settlement continued to spread across the Balkans. New states emerged from this world, and among them, Bulgaria became the most dangerous. Its rise changed the entire balance of power in southeastern Europe. More than once, Bulgarian rulers pushed Byzantium to the edge of disaster. Not just through war, but through direct challenges to the empire's political and ideological authority. Later centuries would see similar tensions with Serbia, whose rulers also dreamed of inheriting the imperial role once held only by Constantinople. Again and again, Byzantium had to defend not only its borders, but its claim to be the centre of the civilized and Christian world. When we step back and look at the northern frontier as a whole, a clear pattern begins to appear. Whether in the Caucasus, in Crimea, or along the Danube, Byzantine diplomacy followed the same essential logic. The empire wanted to stop danger before it reached its core. It preferred to weaken enemies at a distance, divide them, turn them against one another, or absorb them into a wider imperial system. The goal was never only survival in a narrow military sense. Byzantium also sought to extend its influence beyond its frontiers by creating a ring of dependent or friendly states. These were not always provinces in the formal sense, but they were expected to accept Byzantine religion, imperial prestige, and some measure of Constantinople's political leadership. This was one of the deepest continuities in Byzantine statecraft. From the age of Justinian to the Macedonian emperors, the same broad vision remained visible. Methods became more refined over time, but the essential approach endured. Diplomacy was not seen as something separate from power. It was power, shaped into a subtler form. Military pressure, intelligence gathering, economic reward, religious influence, marriage alliances, ceremonial prestige, and patient negotiation were all combined into one carefully designed system. In Byzantine hands, diplomacy became an instrument as important as armies or fortifications. At the heart of this system stood a powerful idea about the empire itself. The Byzantines believed their state was not simply one kingdom among many. In their eyes, it was the rightful centre of the civilized world. Its emperor was not merely a ruler of one people, but the legitimate sovereign of the universal order. This belief came from Rome, but Byzantium preserved it with remarkable determination. Even when the empire's real power shrank, its vision of itself did not. The emperor remained, in theory, the one lawful ruler set above all others. Constantinople saw itself as the heart of the ordered world, and every other nation had to be placed somewhere in relation to that centre. This universal vision extended most clearly to Christian peoples. especially those who had accepted Orthodox Christianity. In Byzantine thought, such nations belonged in a wider commonwealth led spiritually and politically by the emperor in Constantinople. They might rule themselves in practice, but they still formed part of a larger hierarchy. Their position depended on their strength, their usefulness, their culture, and their relationship to the empire. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Rus all entered this world in one way or another. Even rulers who fiercely defended their independence often accepted, at least in principle, that Constantinople held a unique and superior place. This is what made certain rival rulers so dangerous. Men like Simeon of Bulgaria, or later Stefan Dusan, did not simply want to destroy Byzantium. They wanted to take over its universal role. They understood that there could not easily be two emperors at the center of one Christian world. Beyond this circle lay those whom the Byzantines called barbarians. But this word did not mean what it had once meant in ancient Greece. It was no longer mainly about ethnicity or language. In the Byzantine world, a barbarian was above all someone outside the Orthodox Christian order and outside the emperor's direct authority. A pagan chieftain could cease to be a barbarian by accepting baptism and entering the imperial Christian system. Once converted, he was no longer merely an outsider. He could become an ally, a client, even a spiritual son of the emperor. That is why missionary work was so important. Conversion was not simply a matter of religion. It was also a political act that brought new peoples into the Byzantine sphere. This is why Byzantine foreign policy cannot be separated from Byzantine Christianity. The empire believed it had a sacred duty. It saw itself as the chosen guardian of the true faith, and as the power destined to carry that faith to other peoples. The spread of Christianity and the expansion of imperial influence were treated as parts of the same mission. When diplomacy was strong, missionary work flourished, and when missionary work succeeded, diplomacy gained new foundations. This connection became especially powerful in the 9th and 10th centuries, when Byzantine influence surged northward once again. New Christian societies emerged among the Slavs, and a broad cultural community began to form under the guidance of Constantinople. The achievements of this period were extraordinary. The Khazar ruler was persuaded to tolerate Christians in his realm. Missionaries were sent into Central Europe to preach among the Slavs in their own language. Bulgaria was brought into the Christian world. Even the Rus, once feared as raiders from the north, were gradually drawn into baptism and imperial prestige. These were not isolated events. Together, they marked the creation of a new religious and cultural sphere across Eastern Europe, one shaped profoundly by Byzantium. Of course, ideals alone were not enough. Byzantine rulers knew that ideas had to be supported by practical methods. One of the simplest and most effective was money. The empire paid large sums to secure alliances, calm dangerous neighbours, or reward useful rulers. Sometimes these payments were little more than tribute forced by circumstance. But Byzantium preferred to view them differently. In imperial thinking, such gifts were not humiliating concessions. They were payments made by a great emperor to those who served the wider order of the empire. In this way, even tribute could be transformed into a symbol of connection and dependence. Alongside money came titles, honours, and ranks drawn from the elaborate hierarchy of the Byzantine court. Foreign rulers were given prestigious designations that flattered their pride while also placing them within an imperial structure headed by the emperor alone. These titles were more than decoration. They signalled the ruler's place within the Byzantine world order. Sometimes the honours granted were astonishingly high, especially when the empire needed a major diplomatic concession. Through such gestures, Constantinople could bind ambitious rulers to itself without surrendering the principle of imperial supremacy. Religion reinforced all of this even more deeply. a newly converted ruler might become the emperor's spiritual son. His church would often receive clergy, law, liturgy, and religious texts from Byzantium. This created dependence, but it also offered cultural dignity. One of the greatest Byzantine achievements was the use of the Slavonic liturgy and the translation of scripture into the language of the Slavs. This allowed new Christian peoples to enter the Byzantine religious world without losing their own voice. They could become Orthodox without becoming Greek. That flexibility gave Byzantine influence enormous staying power. At the same time, diplomacy abroad was supported by careful management at home. Constantinople itself was part of the empire's foreign policy. Ambassadors arriving from distant lands were meant to be overwhelmed. The government watched them carefully, controlled what they could see, and staged receptions that displayed order, wealth, and majesty. Some accounts speak of mechanical wonders in the palace, golden trees, roaring lions, and moving thrones. Whether these details astonished or amused foreign visitors, the larger effect was unmistakable. They were entering a city unlike any other they had known. The true power of Byzantine diplomacy was not in tricks, but in the overwhelming reality of Constantinople itself. The city's walls, palaces, churches, and ceremonies formed a language of power that required no translation. Foreign envoys saw not just a capital, but a vision of sacred empire made visible. Nothing expressed this more powerfully than the great Church of Holy Wisdom. Visitors from distant lands could be shaken by what they saw there. The beauty of the rituals, the richness of the decoration, the feeling that heaven and earth had somehow come close together, all of this worked as a form of persuasion more powerful than argument. It was through such experiences that many outsiders came to feel that the God of the Byzantines truly dwelled among them. Trying to judge the full success or failure of Byzantine diplomacy is never simple. The picture is too large and the evidence is too uneven to allow easy conclusions. Still, some clear patterns can be seen. First of all, Byzantine diplomacy should not be romanticized. It was brilliant, flexible, and often highly effective, but it was not always admired by the people it tried to control. Not every northern ruler was impressed by the grand political language of Constantinople, or by the imperial belief that the emperor stood at the center of the civilized world. Some saw through the ceremony, the titles and the claims of universal authority with sharp and mocking eyes. When the Avar ruler Bayan demanded the city of Sirmium from the emperor, he ridiculed the language of imperial kinship and adoption, saying, in effect, that if the emperor truly claimed to be his father, then he should give a son what was owed to him. It was a mocking reply, but it revealed something important. The Byzantine system could appear majestic from within, yet from outside it could also seem self-serving, theatrical, and deeply opportunistic. That distrust was made even sharper by one of Byzantium's favourite diplomatic habits, setting one enemy against another. The empire became exceptionally skilled at encouraging rival, barbarian peoples to fight among themselves. This was often an effective strategy, but it also created bitterness. Those who were used as pieces in this larger game did not always forget the experience. There were moments when Byzantine envoys were confronted openly with this reputation. One dramatic example came when an ambassador of Justin II visited the Turks of Central Asia. Instead of being welcomed, he was met with fierce anger. The Turkish ruler accused the Romans of speaking with many tongues and using each one to deceive a different people. He saw them as masters of manipulation, flattering one group, betraying another, and always profiting from the ruin of others. His words may have been harsh, but they show how Byzantine diplomacy could be viewed by those on the receiving end. It was admired for its cleverness, but it could also be hated for its cunning. At times, the Byzantine way of thinking could also become trapped by its own past. The empire was heir to Rome, and that inheritance gave it strength, but it could also burden policy with old habits and old dreams. There were moments when Byzantine rulers seemed more attracted to the glory of classical memory than to the practical demands of frontier defence. Justinian, for all his brilliance, may have fallen partly into this pattern. His imagination was drawn toward great wars in the east, toward struggles that echoed the ancient conflicts of Greece and Persia, and toward the reconquest of lost Roman lands in the west. Against such grand visions, the brutal and exhausting work of defending the Danube frontier against tribal invasions may have seemed less noble, less glorious, and less worthy of imperial ambition. Yet it was precisely there, on those muddy river borders and exposed Balkan plains, that the future of the empire was often decided. Because this frontier was not always protected strongly enough, Justinian's successors were forced to pay a heavy price. When we look more closely at Byzantine diplomacy, one striking feature is its deep inner contradiction. It combined opposites that do not seem as if they should belong together. It was conservative and adaptable at the same time. It could be arrogant in one moment and remarkably open in the next. It defended an imperial idea of universal authority, yet often acted with a realism that recognized limits and accepted compromise. It could seek domination, yet it could also be unexpectedly generous, even culturally generous, when doing so served a larger purpose. This dual nature can be seen especially clearly in Byzantium's treatment of the Slavic world. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire actively supported the spread of Christianity among the Slavs in their own language. It helped create the conditions for a Slavic Christian culture to emerge without forcing it into a purely Greek mould. But in later periods, there were also efforts to impose Greek influence more aggressively, pushing toward cultural control and pressure from above. Both impulses seem to have existed within Byzantine policy, and the balance between them shifted over time. Yet when Byzantium was at its strongest and wisest, especially under the Macedonian emperors, it often leaned toward a policy of calculated generosity. Those rulers understood that influence could be deepened not only by force, but by allowing others to keep their language, their customs, and a measure of dignity within the wider orbit of imperial civilization. Even with all its limitations, Byzantine diplomacy was, in the broadest sense, remarkably successful. Again and again it helped save the empire from destruction. It delayed invasions, redirected threats, recruited allies, and drew hostile peoples into a larger political and religious world centered on Constantinople. Through diplomacy, Byzantium did more than protect itself. It helped shape the future of Eastern Europe. By bringing so many peoples of the Balkans and the lands north of the Black Sea into the world of Christianity, and into the cultural sphere of the Eastern Roman Empire, it changed the history of the continent. Many of the nations that later emerged in those regions first learned the language of diplomacy, rulership, religion, and political legitimacy through contact with Byzantium. Some of these traditions later passed further west as well. In that sense, Byzantine diplomacy did not die with the empire. Parts of it continued to live on in the political culture of Europe, long after Constantinople's power had faded. There is even something strikingly modern about this legacy. Byzantium never abandoned belief in the truth of its own values. It saw itself as the guardian of the true faith, the rightful heir of Rome, and the centre of civilized order. Yet at the same time it was willing to negotiate, to compromise, to recognize facts on the ground, and to deal with enemies who did not share its worldview. It held firm ideas and practical flexibility together in one system. That balance was one of its greatest strengths. The centuries between the death of Justinian and the destruction of the First Bulgarian Empire under Basil II reveal this system at its fullest intensity. These were some of the hardest and most defining centuries in Byzantine history. In military terms, it was a heroic age. The empire spent much of this time fighting not only for its frontiers, but often for survival itself, resisting repeated assaults from Avars, Slavs, Bulgars, Magyars, Rus, and Pechenegs. Yet this was also the period when Byzantine diplomacy reached a high level of maturity. It was under the pressure of this northern challenge that the empire refined diplomacy into one of its most powerful weapons. Careful observation, long experience, constant adaptation, deep religious confidence, and a hard understanding of geography all came together. Byzantine statesmen learned to study the lands beyond their frontiers with increasing seriousness. Their reports, manuals, strategic writings, chronicles, and histories show a growing awareness that the north was not a distant background. It was one of the key arenas on which imperial security depended. That northern world stretched across a vast zone, from the Hungarian plain in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east. It included the Carpathians, the southern Russian steppe, and the broad lands north of the Caucasus. Great rivers flowed through it, shaping movement and power. From this immense arc came the endless procession of tribes and peoples who entered Byzantine history through war, trade, migration, and alliance. Within this wide northern zone, 3 regions carried special importance for the empire: the Danube, the Crimea, and the Caucasus. These were the main hinges of Byzantine strategy, the critical sectors where pressure could be resisted, redirected, or absorbed. The Caucasus was vital because it linked several worlds at once. It stood between the Black Sea and the Caspian, between the Mediterranean and the steppe, between Anatolia and the great powers of the Iranian plateau. Whoever influenced this region could shape both military movement and long-distance trade. Byzantine policy here aimed at building a chain of allied or dependent peoples from the Volga region and the Sea of Azov down toward Armenia and Lake Van. These peoples occupied different strategic positions, and each could serve the empire in a different way. Along the eastern coast of the Black Sea, tribes could support Byzantine naval operations and protect the northeastern flank. Further south, other groups helped guard the approaches to the northern edge of Asia Minor. In the central Caucasus and around the northern passes, local powers could block steppe nomads from breaking southward into imperial lands. Byzantine diplomacy under Justinian worked hard to pull these peoples into its orbit. Some were converted to Christianity, which tied them more closely to Constantinople, not only spiritually, but politically. Churches, roads, fortresses, and local alliances helped make Byzantine presence real and lasting. Material investment supported diplomatic influence. The empire did not simply flatter local rulers. It connected them to a larger system and expected them to play a role within it. At the northern edge of this Caucasian zone lay the steppe lands between the lower Volga and the Sea of Azov. These open lands mattered because they formed part of the great corridor along which mounted peoples moved westward. If a strong and friendly power controlled this region, it could protect the eastern entrance to the steppe route and help stabilize the whole northern frontier of Byzantium. Justinian had already understood the value of alliances here, and later, rulers continued that pattern. The goal was always the same: to ensure that dangerous movement from Asia could be checked far from the imperial heartland. The Crimea formed the central pillar of Byzantine diplomacy in the north. Throughout these centuries, the empire's possessions and dependent territories there, above all, Cherson, acted as a northern outpost planted directly on the edge of the barbarian world. The Crimea was economically valuable because it linked Byzantium to the resources of the hinterland. Fish, salt, furs, honey, and other goods moved south from the rivers and forests of the north, while Byzantine manufactures moved outward in return. But the political and strategic value of Crimea was even greater. Cherson was an observation tower, a warning station, and a diplomatic base. From there, Byzantine officials could monitor the movements of peoples beyond the Sea of Azov, interfere in their disputes, bribe one group, strengthen another, and keep trouble away from the Balkans. This was the old Roman policy in a new age. If direct control was impossible, then rival powers could at least be balanced against one another. If they could not be mastered, they could be weakened and watched. Even in Crimea, Byzantium sought supporting allies nearby. In the southern mountains of the peninsula, the Crimean Goths played just such a role. They were not an empire's province in the ordinary sense, but they served as a useful local force, half dependent and half autonomous, helping counter powers from the steppe. This again reflects the Byzantine method. The empire did not need absolute direct rule everywhere. It needed a network of useful relationships. The Danube, however, was different. Unlike the Caucasus and Crimea, which offered space for indirect control and diplomatic shaping, the Danube was an exposed military frontier. It marked a direct zone of collision. The lower Danube stood near the western end of the Great Steppe route, and if invaders passed safely through the regions farther east, they could reach the Balkans from there. Constantinople itself, though protected magnificently by sea, was always vulnerable to attack by land through Thrace. This harsh geographic truth shaped the history of southeastern Europe for centuries. Justinian had already faced repeated pressure on the Danube from Kutrigas and Slavs. Slavic raids into the Balkans had begun earlier and grew stronger throughout the 6th century. They came from lands north of the Carpathians and gradually spread southward, damaging the empire's hold over the region. Justinian tried to answer this challenge through fortification and diplomacy, but these measures could not fully compensate for a shortage of troops and for the empire's other military commitments. When he died in 565, the entire Danubian situation entered a more dangerous phase. The Avars now became the central threat. These peoples, driven westward from Asia, arrived near the end of Justinian's reign and quickly sought contact with Byzantium. At first, they offered service and alliance. They promised submission and military aid. From Constantinople's point of view, such a people could potentially help reduce pressure on the frontier. But they soon proved far more dangerous than useful. As they expanded into Central Europe and took control of the Hungarian plain, they transformed the balance of power along the northern frontier. Their ruler, Bayan, was both a ruthless conqueror and a highly capable diplomat. He understood the value of strongholds such as Sirmium, the key city guarding northern Illyricum. Byzantium resisted him as long as it could, but the empire was stretched thin. Tension deepened, tribute was demanded, negotiations alternated with threats. At one stage, Byzantine diplomacy in the Danube zone became entangled with policy in the far northeast, when the empire entered into contact with the Turks of Central Asia. Those Turks offered access to the silk trade and the possibility of cooperation against Persia. For a time, an alliance was formed. It served both economic and military interests, but these connections proved fragile. The Turks later accused Byzantium of betrayal, especially because of its dealings with the Avars, whom the Turks regarded as runaway subjects. The alliance collapsed, and the empire was reminded once again of the risks that came with trying to manage too many rival peoples at once. Meanwhile, the Danube frontier continued to deteriorate. New raids spread through Thrace, Illyricum, and Greece. Slavic invasions became more intense. Sirmium, despite its great strategic importance, was eventually lost. The Balkans suffered repeated devastation. Maurice, one of the last emperors to mount a serious recovery on the Danube before total collapse, managed for a time to restore strength. After ending the Persian War, he brought experienced Eastern troops back into Europe. Under his command, imperial forces crossed the Danube, fought the Slavs on their own ground, and even struck decisive blows against the Avars in their core territories. For a moment, it seemed the empire might regain control, but the effort could not be sustained. Military exhaustion, financial strain, and mutiny shattered the recovery. Maurice fell, and with his fall, the Danubian frontier essentially broke apart. Under Phocas and then Heraclius, the consequences became severe and permanent. Avar and Slav invasions surged across the Balkans. Provinces were overrun, cities were sacked. New settlements spread across imperial territory. Thessalonica was repeatedly attacked. The countryside was transformed. Even Constantinople itself came under direct threat. The Great Crisis reached its peak in 626, when the Avars and their allies assaulted the capital, while Persian forces stood on the opposite side of the Bosporus. The city survived through courage, strong defences and control of the sea. But the danger had been real. Heraclius could not reverse the Slavic settlement of the Balkans, but he did attempt to stabilise the frontier through diplomacy. He worked to weaken Avar power by supporting or benefiting from the rise of other peoples. Among the most important of these were the Serbs and the Croats, who were drawn into the Balkans and settled there under imperial authority or protection. Their arrival helped reduce Avar influence and create new structures of order in shattered regions. These peoples were later converted to Christianity, adding another layer to their connection with Byzantium. Even amid chaos, the empire tried to rebuild control not simply through force, but through the placing of new allies in key strategic spaces. Heraclius also acted in the northeastern frontier. As older alliances faded and the Turkish situation shifted, a new power rose among the Bulgaric peoples north of the Caucasus. This was the realm later known as Old Great Bulgaria. Its ruler Kovrat had close ties to Constantinople and had been shaped by Byzantine influence from a young age. His kingdom served the empire well, standing as a barrier in the north and helping resist pressure from both Avars and Turks. But after his death, that kingdom broke apart under Khazar pressure, and the movement of peoples began again. Some groups moved north and formed the Volga-Bulgar state. Others moved west under Asparuh and appeared at the Danube. This was a decisive turning point. When Asparuh's Bulgars crossed southward and defeated imperial resistance, Byzantium was forced to recognize a new independent power on what had once been imperial land. In 681, peace was made, tribute was agreed, and the existence of the Bulgarian state was accepted. This marked the formal end of the old Danubian frontier system. A new power now stood permanently on the empire's flank. It would remain there for centuries and would become one of Byzantium's greatest rivals. From this fusion of Bulgar warriors and Slavic populations emerged the First Bulgarian Empire, one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe. The rise of Bulgaria quickly became central to Byzantine policy. Already at the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th, the Balkans, Crimea, and the Caucasian frontier were becoming interconnected in complicated ways. Justinian II, after being overthrown and exiled to Cherson, fled to Khazaria and then sought help from the Bulgar ruler Tervel. With Bulgar support, he regained Constantinople. Tervel was rewarded with the title of Caesar, an extraordinary honour for a foreign ruler. To the Bulgarians, this may have seemed a sign of immense elevation. To the Byzantines, it was a controlled concession, a way of honouring a useful ally without surrendering the central principle that only the emperor in Constantinople stood at the summit of universal rule. At the same time, Byzantium was struggling with Khazar influence in Crimea. The Khazars had expanded westward and challenged imperial authority in Bosporus and Cherson. Justinian's own reckless actions helped, drive parts of Crimea into their hands. Yet over time, a new understanding emerged between Byzantium and the Khazars. The empire had already seen their value in Caucasian strategy. Heraclius had worked with them against Persia, and in the 8th century the common threat of Islam drew the two powers even closer. The Khazar Khaganate became one of Byzantium's most important allies in the northeast. Their role was crucial. By holding back Arab expansion in the Caucasus, they helped prevent the entire Byzantine northern defense system from being outflanked. They also contributed to trade, helping connect the empire to northern resources and eastern goods after the loss of Syria and Egypt. Relations between Constantinople and the Khazar capital remained close for generations. Even marriage linked the two powers. In 733, the future emperor Constantine V married a Khazar princess. She entered Constantinople, received a Christian name, and even influenced court fashion. Such details may seem small, but they reveal the deeper truth of Byzantine diplomacy. Alliances were not only military agreements, they were reinforced by religion, ceremony, titles, kinship, exchange, and prestige. Byzantium survived because it understood how to turn all these elements into instruments of power. Byzantine leaders were never content with political alliances alone. If they could, they always tried to strengthen those relationships through religion. That is exactly what they attempted with the Khazars. From Constantinople's point of view, the ideal outcome was clear. An ally who shared the empire's faith would also be more firmly tied to its influence. Yet the story did not unfold as smoothly as they hoped. In an unexpected way, even internal conflict within Byzantium played a role in this effort. During the period when emperors were fighting against the use of religious images, many monks who defended traditional beliefs were forced to flee from the heart of the empire. Large numbers of them moved toward frontier regions, especially to the Crimea. What might have seemed like a crisis at home turned into an opportunity abroad. These exiled monks carried with them not only their faith, but also the culture and traditions of Byzantium. In places like Cherson and the surrounding regions, their presence strengthened Byzantine influence and turned the peninsula into an even more active centre for missionary work. At the same time, the authorities in Constantinople showed a certain level of pragmatism. While suppressing religious opposition within their own territory, they were quite willing to use these same religious figures in distant regions to spread Christianity. From Crimea, the faith gradually spread northward into Khazar lands. There were even plans, at least on paper, to create a wide network of churches stretching from the Crimea deep into the Khazar realm and toward the Caucasus. Whether this network was ever fully realized is uncertain. But the ambition itself shows how seriously Byzantium took the idea of religious expansion as part of its diplomacy. However, the Khazar world was not an empty field waiting to be shaped by Byzantine influence. Other religious forces were active there as well. Judaism and Islam both competed for influence among the Khazars. Over time, the ruling elite of the Khazar state began to move toward Judaism. This shift did not happen suddenly, but gradually, through stages, until the ruling circles finally adopted Jewish law. For Byzantium, this was a clear failure. The dream of turning a powerful northern ally into a Christian partner had slipped away. Yet this religious difference did not destroy the political alliance. The two powers continued to cooperate, proving that Byzantine diplomacy could remain flexible even when its ideological goals were not achieved. While attention was divided between the northeast and the steppe, the situation in the Balkans had become even more troubling. By the 7th and early 8th centuries, the region had changed dramatically. Large parts of the peninsula were now occupied by Slavic groups. The Old Greek population had either retreated to coastal cities or been absorbed into new communities. For nearly 2 centuries, vast areas of Greece and the Peloponnese remained outside direct Byzantine control. Beyond these lands stretched a wide and continuous Slavic world, reaching from the Adriatic and the Aegean all the way to the Baltic. This transformation posed a serious challenge. The empire was no longer dealing with scattered raids, but with deep and lasting changes in population and control. Yet even in this difficult period, Byzantine influence did not disappear entirely. In the eastern coastal regions, Greek communities survived and even grew stronger with new arrivals from inland areas. These enclaves became starting points for a slow recovery. The Slavic groups at this stage had not yet developed strong, centralized political systems in these southern regions, which gave Byzantium an opportunity to act. The first steps toward recovery came through military campaigns. Emperors began to push back into parts of the Balkans, re-establishing some level of control. New administrative regions were created to organize these reclaimed areas. But progress was slow and uneven. It was only toward the end of the 8th century that the tide began to turn more clearly. Campaigns were launched into Greece and the Peloponnese, subduing local tribes and reintroducing imperial authority. Over time, Byzantine control spread again, supported not only by soldiers and officials, but also by missionaries who worked to integrate the local population into the Christian and cultural framework of the empire. At the same time, a major effort was made to eliminate one of the greatest threats on the northern frontier. For about 2 decades, a determined campaign was launched against Bulgaria. The emperor, leading this effort, understood that military strength alone would not be enough. He exploited internal divisions within the Bulgarian state, especially the tensions between its ruling elite and the Slavic population. Through repeated campaigns, he managed to win several victories and weaken the enemy. Yet even these successes were not enough to destroy Bulgaria completely. The state survived, damaged, but still dangerous, and its hostility toward Byzantium only deepened. Soon after, Bulgaria demonstrated just how resilient it could be. Under a powerful new ruler, it expanded its territory and reasserted itself as a major force. Taking advantage of the collapse of older powers in Central Europe, Bulgaria grew into a large and formidable state. Its armies inflicted a devastating defeat on the Byzantines, even killing the emperor in battle. This was a shocking event, one that deeply damaged the prestige of Constantinople. For a moment, it seemed that the balance of power in the Balkans had shifted decisively against the empire. Yet even in this crisis, Byzantium survived. The Bulgarian ruler who had brought such destruction did not live long enough to complete his plans. After his death, a long period of peace followed. This peace gave Byzantium something it desperately needed: time. During these years, influence from Constantinople began to spread quietly into Bulgaria. Trade, diplomacy, and the presence of prisoners and settlers all helped introduce new ideas. Christianity, in particular, began to make its way into Bulgarian society. Although the ruling elite initially resisted, fearing that religion could become a tool of Byzantine control, the process could not be stopped entirely. With the Balkan front temporarily stabilized, the empire turned its attention again to the northern frontier. There were still problems to solve. Crimea remained restless, and Khazar loyalty could not be taken for granted. But under one emperor, the situation improved significantly. The Khazar ruler himself asked for Byzantine help in building a fortress on the Don River, showing that the alliance was still active. Byzantine engineers were sent, and a new defensive system was created, linking the Crimea with key points in the steppe. This network served both sides. It helped the Khazars defend their territory, and allowed Byzantium to maintain its strategic position between the Volga and the Danube. Not long after, a new and unexpected threat appeared. In the year 860, a fleet of northern warriors suddenly sailed into the waters near Constantinople. These were the Rus, Scandinavian adventurers who had moved down the river systems of Eastern Europe and established themselves as a powerful force. Their attack came at a moment when the empire was unprepared. The fleet and army were away, and the capital itself seemed exposed. The surrounding lands were devastated, and panic spread within the city. Yet once again, the defences of Constantinople held. The attackers eventually withdrew, but their appearance marked the beginning of a new era. The rise of the Rus was the result of a long process. Scandinavian traders and warriors had gradually moved southward through the river networks of Eastern Europe, first toward the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world, and later toward the Black Sea and Byzantium. Along the way, they established trading posts and political centres. One of the most important of these was Kiev, which became a major base for their activities. From there, they launched their attack on Constantinople. The Byzantine response was swift and calculated. First, they strengthened their alliance with the Khazars, aiming to contain the new threat from the north. Then, they turned to diplomacy and religion. Envoys from the Rus were received in Constantinople, baptized, and drawn into the sphere of Byzantine influence. A bishop was sent to guide their new Christian community. Although this early effort did not fully transform the Rus at once, it established a foothold that would later prove decisive. At the same time, Byzantine influence was expanding in another direction. In Central Europe, a Slavic ruler sought help from Constantinople, both for political protection and for religious guidance. He wanted Christianity, but in a form his people could understand. The answer came in the form of two remarkable figures from Thessalonica. These brothers were not only missionaries, but also scholars and innovators. One of them created a new writing system for the Slavic language and began translating religious texts into a form that ordinary people could use. This was a revolutionary step. For the first time, Christianity could be taught in the language of the Slavs themselves. A new literary culture was born, one that would spread far beyond its original region. The brothers trained local clergy, introduced new forms of worship, and laid the foundations of a cultural transformation. Their work faced resistance, especially from Western clergy who saw it as a threat to their authority. Yet it gained powerful support, including from the papacy for a time, because it offered an effective way to spread Christianity. Meanwhile, events in Bulgaria were moving quickly. Faced with pressure from both East and West, the Bulgarian ruler made a crucial decision. Under threat from Byzantine military action, he accepted Christianity from Constantinople. This was a turning point. Although he later tried to gain greater independence by turning to Rome, he eventually returned to the Byzantine sphere. The result was the creation of a Bulgarian church linked to Constantinople, but with some autonomy. The most important development came when disciples of the earlier Slavic missionaries found refuge in Bulgaria. There, they continued their work, building school, translating texts, and training clergy. Centres of learning emerged, especially in Macedonia and the Bulgarian capital. These places became the heart of a new Slavic Christian culture. Greek religious and historical works were translated into the Slavic language, making them accessible to a much wider audience. Over time, this cultural movement spread to other regions, shaping the development of Serbian, Russian, and other Eastern European societies. The cultural transformation of Bulgaria gathered even greater force when Boris placed his third son, Simeon, on the throne in 893. Boris had already retired to a monastery, but he returned to remove his eldest son, Vladimir, whose return to pagan habits threatened to undo everything that had been built. Simeon was a very different figure. He was exactly the kind of ruler who could carry his father's work forward. Like Boris, he admired Byzantine civilization, yet he was also deeply committed to the growth of Slavonic culture. Much of his youth had been spent in Constantinople. where he absorbed the education and intellectual atmosphere of the imperial capital. He emerged from that world with a strong command of Greek learning and rhetoric, so much so that people saw him as a man divided between two worlds, a Bulgarian prince shaped in part by the mind of Byzantium. When Simeon returned to his own country, he did not reject what he had learned. Instead, he tried to refashion Bulgaria in the image of a great Christian power. He encouraged literary work, supported the spread of Slavonic writing, and turned his capital at Preslav into a glittering centre of royal magnificence. His ambition was clear. He wanted Preslav to stand as a rival to Constantinople itself. Contemporary observers describe its churches and palaces as dazzling. In the royal court, Simeon appeared in splendour, surrounded by gold, pearls, and imperial display, projecting the image not of a frontier ruler, but of a monarch destined for something much greater. From the perspective of Byzantine diplomacy, all of this could seem like a triumph. The policy begun under Photius and Basil and carried forward through the work of Cyril, Methodius, and their followers had clearly borne fruit. Bulgaria was Christian. It had embraced literary culture. It had absorbed the prestige of Byzantine civilization. Yet beneath the surface, danger was already growing. A ruler like Simeon was not content to remain merely a pupil. He was learning from Byzantium in order to compete with it. The break came suddenly in 894. What had been built over decades was endangered by a careless act from the imperial government. Through intrigue at court, Byzantine merchants gained control over Bulgarian trade and shifted the commercial centre from Constantinople to Thessalonica, where new taxes were imposed on Bulgarian goods. To Simeon, this was not just an economic inconvenience. It was an insult, a direct challenge to the dignity and interests of his state. He responded immediately, invading Thrace, defeating a Byzantine force, and advancing toward the imperial heartland. With that, the long peace in the Balkans came to an end. The emperor at the time did what Byzantine rulers had done so many times before. Lacking the right troops in the right place, he turned to diplomacy and tried to use another northern people against Bulgaria. The chosen instrument was the Magyars, who were then settled in the steppe lands between the lower Dnieper and the lower Danube. These people, shaped by both Finno-Ugrian roots and Turkic influence, had become an important force in the region. Byzantine envoys persuaded them to strike at Simeon from the rear. Transported across the Danube with imperial help, they invaded northeastern Bulgaria and inflicted a series of defeats. But Simeon proved more than capable of playing Byzantium's own game. While pretending to negotiate, he trapped the Byzantine ambassador in a drawn-out exchange full of delays, arguments, and calculated mockery. During that time, he quietly prepared his counterstroke. He turned to the Pechenegs, another powerful Turkic people who had recently moved westward into the lands near the Dnieper. With their support, he struck at the Magyars. The result was dramatic. The Magyars returned to find their homeland lost, and had no choice but to move west across the Carpathians. There they entered the Pannonian Plain, destroyed the Moravian realm, and laid the foundations of medieval Hungary. This was one of the great turning points in the history of Eastern Europe. Simeon had not only defeated his immediate enemies, he had reshaped the political map of the region. At the same time, he turned back against Byzantium and crushed its forces at Bulgarophygon in 896. A new peace followed, but it was peace on Bulgarian terms. The empire was forced to pay a yearly subsidy. Byzantium had lost far more than a battle. Its whole strategic position in the Balkans had been weakened. A bold and intelligent ruler now stood at the edge of Thrace, and his influence was spreading among the Slavs of Serbia and the Western Balkans. And yet, these same upheavals brought one unintended benefit for Byzantium. Until then, The Slavic world had stretched in an almost unbroken belt from the Balkans deep into Central Europe. The westward movement of the Magyars split that world in two. It ended any serious possibility that a single united Slavic empire could emerge across this vast region. It also blocked Bulgaria from expanding freely into Central Europe. In that sense, one danger had been exchanged for another. At the same time, another great power was rising farther north. In the lands of the Dnieper, the early Russian state was taking shape. The Christian communities established there by earlier Byzantine missions had entered difficult times. Around 882, a Varangian ruler named Oleg came south from Novgorod, seized Kiev, and united the route from the Baltic toward the Black Sea under his authority. This was a decisive event. For the first time, the river highway from the forests of the north to the riches of Byzantium was largely controlled by a single power. The formation of Kievan Rus was not a simple event with a single cause. Slavic communities had long been active in trade and politics under Iranian and Turkic overlords before the arrival of the Scandinavians. Yet, it was the Viking element that gave this world a sharper political unity. The Varangians bound together scattered territories and gave the new state its name. Under Oleg, Kiev became more than a trading post. It became the center of an expanding power whose gaze was fixed on the south. A wave of renewed pagan energy swept through this world, and the aggressive instincts of the Viking elite returned to the foreground. In 907, Oleg led a massive expedition against Constantinople. The suburbs of the imperial capital were ravaged, and the Byzantines were forced to come to terms. The treaty that followed in 911 granted significant privileges to Russian merchants in Constantinople. This agreement helped preserve peace for several decades, but it also marked the growing importance of Rus in Byzantine policy. The rulers of Kiev were becoming wealthier, more organized, and more deeply tied to the commercial life of the Black Sea world. Still, as long as they remained pagan and viewed Kiev as a base for plunder and opportunity, they posed a serious danger to both Cherson and the empire itself. For a time, peace in the Balkans held after 896. But with the death of Leo VI in 912, everything changed. What followed was one of the most dangerous confrontations Byzantium had ever faced. Simeon had waited patiently for his moment, and now the empire looked weak. The ruler on the throne was a child. Government in Constantinople was unstable. Court factions struggled for control. Simeon saw his opening and marched into Thrace. When he appeared before Constantinople in 913, he acted much as Crum had done a century earlier. He surveyed the city, recognized the immense difficulty of taking it by force, and chose to negotiate. The details of those negotiations remain unclear, but what matters is the direction of his ambition. He may have received recognition as Emperor of the Bulgarians. More importantly, he was promised a marriage alliance that would tie his family to the imperial house itself. This possibility seems to have awakened in him the full scale of his dream. He no longer wanted merely prestige within Bulgaria. He wanted entrance into the imperial center. He wanted power in Constantinople. This is the key to understanding Simeon. He was not trying to create an equal empire beside Byzantium, as if two universal Christian empires could exist side by side in the Balkans. He had been too deeply shaped by Byzantine political thought for that. He knew the imperial idea too well. There could only be one true empire, one center of the civilized Christian world, and that center was Constantinople. His aim was not to rival the empire, but to take possession of it. The Byzantine patriarch Nicholas understood this perfectly. Over many years he tried with extraordinary patience to restrain Simeon, to flatter him, negotiate with him, and persuade him to step back. But on one point, he never gave way. He would not surrender the core principle of Byzantine political philosophy. The empire, in his view, stood above all other earthly authority and could not simply be claimed by a foreign ruler through force or ambition. To him, Simeon's dream was not legitimate greatness. It was unlawful usurpation. At first, Simeon may have hoped to gain influence through marriage and dynastic politics, but events in Constantinople moved against him. The promised alliance slipped away as power shifted at court. Frustrated, he returned to war. He invaded Thrace and Macedonia, and in 917 he destroyed a Byzantine army at the river Achelous in one of the most crushing defeats the empire suffered in the Balkans. Another victory followed near Constantinople itself. At that moment, Simeon seemed master of almost the entire peninsula. His dominions stretched from the Black Sea to the Adriatic and from the Danube deep into the south. Byzantium appeared close to collapse. Yet once again, the empire survived through a combination of diplomacy and political adaptability. While the regency government faltered, a new figure rose in Constantinople. Romanus Lecapenus, an admiral of humble origins but great ability, gradually climbed to supreme power. Through marriage alliances and court maneuvering, he reached the throne by the very path Simeon had hoped to use. By the time he was crowned co-emperor, the Bulgarian ruler had lost the race for control of the imperial center. Simeon reacted with fury. He demanded the removal of Romanus and continued his invasions year after year, repeatedly reaching the approaches of Constantinople. But Romanus had a strategy. He allowed Simeon to exhaust himself in attacks that could not break the city. Meanwhile, Byzantine diplomacy went to work in the background. It stirred up resistance against Bulgaria in Serbia. It sought to organize wider coalitions among the northern peoples. It blocked Simeon's attempts to secure naval support from Egypt. The empire turned its old talents to full effect. In 924, when Simeon appeared before Constantinople for the last time, he understood that without a fleet, he could not hope to take the city. He agreed to negotiate directly with Romanus. Their meeting on the Golden Horn became one of the most dramatic moments in medieval Balkan history. Chroniclers describe the encounter as a clash between two visions of rule, one built on conquest and one on imperial legitimacy. However the details unfolded, the deeper truth is clear. After this meeting, Simeon's dream was broken. He could still issue grand titles and elevate his own church, and he could still call himself Emperor of Bulgarians and Romans, but these gestures could not hide the failure. The walls of Constantinople had held. The patience of Romanus had held. Byzantine diplomacy had held. Simeon died in 927, and with him ended the greatest Bulgarian challenge the empire had yet faced. His son Peter was a very different ruler. Gentle, pious, and far less aggressive, he accepted peace with Byzantium. A marriage alliance was arranged between the Bulgarian ruler and a granddaughter of Romanus. Peter was recognized as Emperor of Bulgaria, and the Bulgarian Patriarchate was acknowledged as independent. On the surface, these looked like major concessions. In reality, they were signs of Byzantine triumph. Bulgaria had been drawn back into the imperial orbit. The marriage alliance placed Constantinople's influence directly inside the Bulgarian court. Peter, though honoured, became increasingly dependent and politically passive. The decline of Bulgaria changed the entire balance of the north. For many decades, it had acted as a barrier between Byzantium and the peoples beyond the Danube. Now, that barrier was weaker. New threats from the steppe could more easily move toward the imperial frontier. This meant that Byzantine diplomacy became even more important than before. Under Romanus and Constantine VII, the empire entered one of its most successful diplomatic periods. In the Balkans, Byzantium restored influence over Serbia, maintained control over the cities of Dalmatia, and kept a degree of authority in Croatia. The main new danger came from the Magyars, who raided Thrace on more than one occasion. But even here, diplomacy provided a response. Magyar leaders were invited to Constantinople, baptized, honoured with titles, and drawn into the imperial sphere. Missionaries were sent among them, and for a time these efforts produced a pause in the raids. Nowhere, however, was diplomacy more vital than in the Crimea and the northern steppe. Cherson proved once again why it had to be held at all costs. The old Khazar alliance was weakening, and new conditions demanded a new strategy. In the first half of the 10th century, Byzantium shifted its support toward the Pechenegs. These steppe nomads had become a dominant force between the Danube and the Don. By the middle of the century, alliance with them was the cornerstone of imperial policy in the north. Constantine VII emphasized this openly. If the Pechenegs remained friendly, Crimea could be protected, trade with Rus could continue, and other northern powers such as Bulgarians, Magyars, and Russians would hesitate to attack. At the same time, Kievan Rus was growing stronger. In 941, Igor, successor to Oleg, led a major expedition by sea against Byzantium. After being checked at the Bosphorus, the invaders landed in Bithynia and devastated the coast. But when they withdrew, the imperial navy struck back with Greek fire, destroying much of the Russian fleet in one of the most famous naval defeats of the age. A few years later, in 944, Igor tried again, this time with a larger force and Pechenege allies. But the Byzantines were warned in advance by their agents in Cherson. Romanus acted quickly, offering payments and diplomacy where necessary, and the danger was once again contained. The treaty that followed in 944 was an important marker. Compared with the earlier agreement of 911, it showed that the balance had shifted in favour of Byzantium. Russian privileges were reduced. More significantly, many of the representatives sent by Igor to ratify the treaty came from a Christian community in Kiev. This revealed a deeper change already underway. Trade, diplomacy, and contact with the empire were slowly eroding the pagan isolation of the Rus elite. Christianity was gaining ground. A crucial step came when Igor's widow Olga travelled to Constantinople. There, she was baptized and entered the orbit of Byzantine Christianity in a highly symbolic way, taking the name Helena. Although she could not convert all her people, her contact with the empire prepared the path for the greater transformation that would come in the next generation. In the North Caucasian zone, Byzantine diplomacy was equally active. The Khazars were no longer fully trusted, especially after their turn toward Judaism. Their former role as protectors of the northeastern frontier was now increasingly transferred to the Alans. These people had long been among Byzantium's most loyal allies in the region. Their ruler eventually accepted Christianity, and the empire came to regard Alania as one of the key supporting states of the northern system. Together with Abaskia and other regional powers, the Alans helped form a belt of influence, stretching across the strategic lands between the Caucasus and the Black Sea. By the middle of the 10th century, Byzantium had once again built a chain of allies and client states across the northern world. From the Hungarian plain through the steppe and into the Caucasus, the empire's diplomats had created a system in which rulers were tied to Constantinople by titles, gifts, religion, prestige, and necessity. Some were fully loyal, others only partially. But together they formed a defensive and political network that gave the empire room to breathe and the chance to expand once more. From the death of Romanus II in 963 to the year 1018, Byzantine policy in the north became focused above all on Bulgaria and Rus. Bulgaria under Peter was sinking into internal crisis. Wealth and land were concentrating in the hands of a powerful aristocracy. Social tensions deepened. Religious unrest spread, especially through the Bogomil movement. which challenged both church and state. At the same time, Peter made a disastrous diplomatic misstep. He demanded further tribute from Constantinople at the very moment when a victorious and confident emperor, Nicephorus Phocas, sat on the Byzantine throne. Nicephorus reacted with fury. He humiliated the Bulgarian envoys and moved troops to the frontier. Yet he was reluctant to campaign personally in Bulgaria, so he turned once again to the old method of using one northern power against another. He sent an envoy to Kiev to bribe the Russian prince Sviatoslav into invading Bulgaria. It was a fateful decision. Sviatoslav was no ordinary ruler. Fierce, pagan, and ambitious, he had already crushed the Khazars and was clearly more than a raider. He was an empire builder. Easily persuaded by Byzantine gold, he crossed the Danube and overran the Dobrudja with alarming speed. But it soon became obvious that he had no intention of behaving like a hired weapon. He withdrew only temporarily after Pecheneg pressure near Kiev, and then returned stronger than before. This time, he seized the Bulgarian capital and much of eastern Bulgaria. His ambition was growing rapidly. He seemed ready to make the lower Danube the centre of a new northern empire. Now, Byzantium faced a terrifying possibility. Sviatoslav aimed openly at Constantinople. A great coalition of Russians, Pechenegs, Magyars, and perhaps even Bulgarians threatened the empire. The envoy originally sent to use him had himself turned traitor and joined his cause. The danger was as great as any the empire had faced since Simeon. The response came under John Tzimiskes. In 970, the Russians invaded Thrace, but were beaten back. Then in the spring of 971, the emperor launched one of the greatest campaigns in Byzantine history. He marched into Bulgaria with a disciplined and well-equipped army, stormed Preslav after bitter fighting, and drove Sviatoslav back to Silistria on the Danube. There, for 3 months, the two sides fought with desperate intensity. The Russians resisted fiercely, but famine, blockade, and the appearance of the imperial fleet with Greek fire broke their strength. At last, Sviatoslav surrendered, agreeing to leave Bulgaria, renounce future attacks on the empire and Cherson, and renew peaceful relations. John Tzimiskes had achieved something extraordinary. In a single campaign, he had restored the Byzantine frontier to the Danube, removed the Russian threat, and annexed Bulgaria. It was one of the greatest victories in the long history of Byzantine northern policy. But even after this triumph, the strategic question remained. Who would now stand between Byzantium and the unstable world of the steppe? The Khazars were broken. The Pechenegs were unreliable. The Magyars were moving towards the orbit of the west. Only the ruler of Kiev, now master of a vast territory, from the Baltic routes to the lower Dnieper, had the potential to become a lasting partner. The empire could not safely leave Rus outside its spiritual and political system. That final step was taken under Basil II. Christianity had been filtering into Rus for generations. Through Bulgaria, through surviving Slavic literary traditions, and through contact with Byzantium itself. But the decisive moment came during one of the most dangerous internal crises of Basil's reign. At the moment when a rebel army threatened him, he received crucial military support from Vladimir of Kiev, who sent thousands of Varangian warriors to assist him. In return, an agreement was made. Vladimir would marry the emperor's sister Anna, but only if he and his people accepted Christianity. For Byzantium, this was a stunning concession. The marriage of a princess born in the purple to a foreign ruler was almost unthinkable. Yet the need was urgent. Basil accepted. When he later hesitated to fulfill the promise, Vladimir acted with force, marching to Crimea and taking Cherson. This dramatic move compelled Constantinople to complete the agreement. Anna was sent across the Black Sea, and with her came clergy, ritual, and the full weight of Byzantine religious influence. Whether Vladimir was baptized before or after the capture of Cherson matters less than the larger truth. Cherson, long the missionary outpost of the empire in the north, had once again become the turning point of a civilization. The city that Vladimir seized ended up transforming him. After his marriage, he returned Cherson to the empire and brought Byzantine Christianity back with him to Kiev. Priests from the Crimean clergy accompanied the new imperial bride and began the work of establishing the faith throughout Rus. Byzantium had every reason to feel proud of its success in the north. Its policy toward the rising power of Rus had worked. Through diplomacy, trade, and religion, a once hostile force had been drawn into its orbit. But while this success unfolded in the north, the situation in the Balkans was quietly collapsing. The victories of Emperor John Tzimiskes had not been fully secured. Byzantine control in Bulgaria existed mainly in the major cities. Beyond them, especially in the rugged lands of the west, imperial authority was weak or non-existent. In the mountainous regions of Macedonia, local power still dominated. When Tzimiskes died in 976, this fragile system broke apart. 4 brothers, sons of a provincial governor, rose in rebellion. What began as a local revolt quickly turned into a broader struggle for independence. Among these brothers, one man emerged as the true leader. His name was Samuel. By the end of the 10th century, he had built a powerful state that stretched across much of the former Bulgarian lands. His capital first stood at Prespa and later at Ohrid. His domain extended from the Adriatic to the Black Sea and deep into the Balkans, including parts of Greece. Around the end of the century, Samuel crowned himself Tsar, openly claiming the legacy of the old Bulgarian Empire. He even restored the Bulgarian Patriarchate, signalling that his state was not just political, but also spiritual in its ambitions. The Byzantine response was not immediate success. Emperor Basil II faced disaster early in his campaign. In 986, after a failed siege, his army was ambushed in a narrow mountain pass and nearly destroyed. For several years afterward, he was forced to deal with internal revolts and could not focus fully on the Bulgarian threat. During this time, Samuel expanded without resistance, pushing deep into Byzantine territory, and even threatening key cities like Thessalonica. But Basil was not a man who forgot defeat. Once he stabilized his empire and secured peace on other fronts, he turned all his attention to Bulgaria. From 1001 onward, he launched a series of campaigns unlike anything seen before. These were not reckless invasions. They were slow, methodical, and relentless. City after city fell. Fortresses were taken one by one. Within a few years, Samuel lost half his empire. The final blow came in 1014. In a narrow mountain pass, Basil trapped the Bulgarian army and crushed it completely. What followed became one of the most infamous acts in medieval history. Thousands of Bulgarian prisoners were blinded, with only a few left partially sighted to lead the rest home. When these shattered soldiers returned, Samuel could not bear the sight. He collapsed and died shortly after. With his death, the resistance of Bulgaria began to crumble. The end came within a few years. Internal struggles weakened what remained of the Bulgarian state. By 1018, Basil completed his conquest. The entire Balkan peninsula, from the Danube to southern Greece, was once again under Byzantine control. For the first time in centuries, the empire stood dominant across the region. Its northern frontiers were secure, its influence extended deep into Eastern Europe, and its cultural reach now included the vast lands of Rus. Yet this moment of triumph also marked the beginning of a much larger story. The connection between Byzantium and Rus had created something enduring. It was not just a political alliance or a temporary influence. It was a cultural transformation that would shape Russian history for for centuries. When we speak about the legacy of Byzantium in Russia, the idea itself can be understood in different ways. It could mean that Byzantine influence is still alive and visible in Russian culture, or it could suggest that this influence belonged only to the past and has since disappeared. In reality, history does not work in such simple terms. Even when something seems to fade, it often leaves traces that continue to shape events in subtle ways. There are two common ways people try to understand this relationship. One approach starts from the present and looks backward. Observers notice features in modern Russia that seem unfamiliar compared to Western Europe. They then search for their origins and often connect them to Byzantium. The other approach begins in the past. It studies Byzantine culture, identifies its influence on medieval Russia, and then follows that influence through time to see how long it survived. Both approaches have their limits. The first can lead to oversimplified conclusions, treating complex historical developments as direct continuations of ancient traditions. The second risks isolating Byzantine influence from the broader context of Russian history, giving it more importance than it may actually have had. History is rarely shaped by a single source. It is always the result of many forces interacting over time. To truly understand Russia's development, it must be placed within a wider world. Russia was never isolated. At different moments in its history, it was deeply connected to Byzantium, to Asia, and to Western Europe. Each of these connections left its mark. The influence of Asia came through the great steppe empires. For centuries, nomadic powers shaped the lands around Russia. At times, Russian rulers even stood at a crossroads, able to turn eastward and become part of that world. Yet the adoption of Christianity created a deep divide. It linked Russia more closely to the Christian world and separated it from the cultural traditions of the East. Western Europe also played a major role, especially from the 18th century onward. Reforms, ideas, and technologies from the West transformed Russia's elite and reshaped its state. But this influence was uneven. While the upper classes embraced Western ways, the vast majority of the population continued to live according to older traditions. This created a deep cultural divide within Russian society. Byzantium, however, had a different kind of impact. Its influence was deeper and more unified. Through Christianity, it reached every level of society. It shaped religion, law, art, and literature. It provided a worldview, a way of understanding authority, faith, and the structure of society. Unlike later Western influences, which often divided Russia, Byzantine culture spread gradually but broadly, becoming part of the foundation of Russian life. In medieval Russia, this influence could be seen everywhere. The church, guided by Constantinople, became a central institution. Byzantine legal traditions mixed with local customs. Art and architecture reflected the styles of the Eastern Roman world. Even the written language developed through earlier Slavic traditions shaped by Byzantine missionaries allowed Russian culture to flourish. This influence did not disappear after the fall of Byzantium. It continued, though in changing forms. Even as Russia expanded and faced new challenges and absorbed new influences, elements of its Byzantine heritage remained visible. They could be seen in religious traditions, in political ideas about authority, and in the cultural memory of a civilization that once stood at the center of the Christian East. Over time, Russia began to move in new directions. Its rulers did not fully embrace the idea of inheriting Byzantium's universal empire. Instead, they focused on building a state centered on their own lands. Gradually, connections with Western Europe increased and new influences reshaped the country. Yet this shift did not erase the past. It layered new elements over an older foundation. The story of Russia, therefore, cannot be understood by looking at one influence alone. It is not purely Eastern nor purely Western. It is the result of a long interaction between different worlds. Among these, Byzantium played a central role. It gave Russia its earliest cultural framework, one that continued to shape its identity, even as history moved forward. And when we step back and look at the broader picture, a larger pattern appears. The lands of Eastern Europe, from the Balkans to Russia, share a common experience. They were shaped by Byzantine Christianity, influenced by steppe empires, and later drawn into the orbit of Western ideas. Their histories are different, but they follow a similar rhythm. Together, they form a cultural world that cannot be fully understood from the perspective of the West alone. The idea of two completely separate worlds quickly falls apart. Instead, what we see is a single civilization divided into two interconnected parts. The East and the West developed differently, but they were never isolated from each other. In fact, many key moments in Western history cannot be fully understood without Byzantium's influence, shaping them in the background. This becomes even clearer when we turn to early Russia. It is often assumed that Russia has always been hostile toward the West, but this is not true for its early history. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the lands of Rus were deeply connected to Europe. Trade linked them with German cities. Scandinavian influence remained strong, and royal marriages tied them to the ruling families of Europe. Even religious contact with Rome continued. Russia, at this stage, was not isolated. It was part of a shared Christian world. The major religious divide between East and West did not immediately change this. For ordinary people, Christianity still felt like a unified faith. A striking example comes from the story of Saint Nicholas. When his relics were taken from the East to Italy, Byzantium saw it as a loss, but in Russia it was celebrated. The Russians believed the saint's presence now blessed the West as well. This shows how strongly they still felt part of a wider Christian community. The real break came later. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century isolated Russia from Europe for generations. At the same time, Western powers began to approach Russia as rivals, rather than partners. From this point on, relations became more tense and distant. Russia would later borrow ideas and technology from the West, but this was no longer the natural exchange of earlier centuries. It was more selective and often limited to the elite. This is why Byzantium is so important. It was not a barrier that separated Russia from Europe. It was the bridge that first connected it. Through Byzantium, Russia adopted Christianity, entered the European world, and developed its earliest cultural identity. What stands out immediately in this moment is the Patriarch's mixed attitude toward the appointment of Alexius. On one side, he clearly wanted to satisfy the rulers of Moscow. On the other, he described Alexius's rise as something unusual and even risky for the Church. That contrast tells us a great deal about the political world of the 14th century. By this time, Moscow was no longer just another Russian principality. It was becoming the strongest political centre in the Russian lands east of Lithuania. Its princes were gathering territory, wealth, and influence, and with the support of the Church and the boyars, they were presenting themselves as the natural leaders of the Russian people. At the same time, Byzantium was in visible decline. Civil war had weakened the empire, enemies pressed it on land, foreign powers challenged it at sea, and money was running short. In that situation, it made perfect sense for the Byzantine authorities to listen carefully to a loyal Orthodox power like Moscow, especially when support from that direction could bring both political and economic advantages. The religious situation made Moscow even more important. In Eastern Europe, the Patriarch of Constantinople was trying to hold together what remained of Byzantine spiritual authority. But by the middle of the 14th century, that authority was under pressure almost everywhere. The Serbian Church had broken away. Bulgaria was also challenging Constantinople. and rival powers were trying to pull Orthodox lands into other spheres of influence. Lithuania posed another danger, since its ruler could threaten to move his Orthodox subjects toward Rome. In this atmosphere, Moscow mattered more than ever. It was one of the few major powers in the region still firmly tied to Constantinople. So when the Patriarch approved Alexius, he was not simply choosing a church leader. He was also protecting the last strong line of influence that Byzantium still possessed in the north. But there was a problem. The Patriarch was a man deeply committed to the idea that church appointments should remain free from political pressure. He belonged to a powerful current within the Byzantine Church that opposed secular interference in religious affairs. For men of this outlook, bishops and metropolitans should be chosen according to church law, not because princes demanded them. That is why Alexius caused discomfort. He had strong backing from Moscow. He had already been marked out as the future metropolitan by his predecessor. His candidacy was supported by powerful rulers. From the Patriarch's point of view, this looked dangerously close to a political appointment. So even though he accepted Alexius, he did so reluctantly, almost defensively, trying to present the decision as an exception rather than a model for the future. This helps explain why the Patriarch insisted that appointing a native Russian to lead the Church of Ruses was not normal practice. Yet that claim does not match the historical pattern very well. For more than a century, Greek and Russian church leaders had followed one another in a striking sequence. The alternation was too regular to dismiss easily as coincidence. This makes the Patriarch's language sound less like a statement of fact and more like an attempt to reshape the narrative. He wanted to defend the independence of church elections and strengthen Constantinople's control, so he spoke as if Alexius represented a dangerous innovation, even though the past suggests otherwise. Another voice from the same period offers a very different picture. A Byzantine historian argued that there had long been an understanding between Byzantium and Rus, one that allowed the leadership of the Russian Church to pass in alternating fashion between Greek and Russian candidates. Whether this arrangement was written down formally or preserved through custom, the pattern of appointments gives that idea real weight. It suggests that the connection between Constantinople and Rus was not maintained by rigid domination alone. It may have rested just as much on compromise, diplomacy, and a willingness to adapt to local realities. When we look back over the 13th and 14th centuries, that broader picture becomes even clearer. Byzantium did not simply impose its will on the Russian Church at every stage. Again and again, Russian princes influenced the choice of metropolitan, especially when native candidates were involved. Constantinople still guarded its authority, but it also made concessions when political necessity demanded it. That balance between principle and flexibility may have been one of the main reasons why the Russian Church stayed tied to Constantinople for so long. The earlier Kievan period is less clear. The evidence is thinner and the pattern is much harder to trace. We cannot see the same neat alternation there with confidence. Even so, the legal and religious traditions known in Rus's show that Russian churchmen were aware of the arguments that could support local elections. They knew the canons, they knew the debates, and over time they increasingly claimed the right to choose and consecrate their own leaders. In later centuries, Russian rulers and bishops openly appealed to those traditions when they defended the election of their own metropolitans without waiting for approval from Constantinople. So, even if the early evidence is incomplete, the long development points in the same direction. The relationship between Byzantium and the Russian Church was never a simple story of obedience. It was a constant negotiation between imperial authority, church law, political reality, and the growing confidence of the Russian world. What becomes clear from these disputes is that the Russian side was not inventing random excuses when it tried to choose its own metropolitan. The men involved seem to have genuinely believed that church law allowed it. In their view, the same rules that governed the appointment of ordinary bishops could also be applied to the head of the Russian church. That belief did not come from simple rebellion. In the tradition of Eastern Christianity, the election of a bishop and the election of a metropolitan were closely related processes. The patriarch had the right to approve or reject the choice, but the local bishops still had an essential role. Because the language of the canons was often technical and at times ambiguous, Russian churchmen could sincerely read these rules as giving them the right not only to choose a candidate, but in some cases even to consecrate him themselves, as long as the final blessing of Constantinople was still recognized. This matters because it shows that the Russian Church's struggle with Byzantium was not only political, it was also legal, theological, and deeply rooted in competing interpretations of church order. The Russians were not simply rejecting Constantinople outright. Very often they were arguing that they remained faithful to the Orthodox tradition while defending a wider role for their own bishops and princes. Even when they pushed the limits, they often still asked for the patriarch's blessing, treating that approval as the final seal rather than as the starting point of the whole process. In their minds, that position was not a break with the Church. It was a lawful arrangement, grounded in the same sacred rules that Byzantium itself claimed to uphold. It is also hard to believe that Russian churchmen discovered these arguments only in the late medieval period. More likely, the same ideas had existed much earlier. The desire to have a metropolitan chosen closer to home, by local rulers and bishops who understood the land and its needs, must have been present from an early stage. This raises a larger question. If Russian leaders in later centuries openly claimed that canon law supported the right to elect and even consecrate their own metropolitan, then perhaps similar claims had already shaped church politics in the age of Kievan Rus. To explore that possibility, we have to look carefully at the earlier metropolitans, at where they came from, and at the way they were appointed. That task is not easy. The evidence from the pre-Mongol period is limited, and many details remain uncertain. Only a few metropolitans can be identified with confidence as Greek or Russian. But even this incomplete record is revealing. Some church leaders were almost certainly Byzantines, either because of their language, their background, or the attitudes they displayed. Others, however, appear much more closely tied to the Russian world. This matters because the traditional picture has long assumed that, except for two famous cases, the metropolitans of Kiev were all Greeks sent directly from Constantinople. Yet the evidence does not fully support such a simple story. The first major test of that traditional view comes with Hilarion in the middle of the 11th century. He is often described as a symbol of resistance to Byzantium, as if his appointment marked an early attempt by Russes to free its church from Greek control. But the situation looks more complex than that. Hilarion was raised to the metropolitan throne in Kiev by the will of Prince Yaroslav, and with the participation of the bishops. At first glance, that may seem like a bold act of independence. Yet the broader political background suggests something else. Relations between Kiev and Byzantium had already improved after earlier conflict. A dynastic marriage had helped restore cooperation, and there is no strong sign that Hilarion's appointment caused an open break between the two churches. Later, tradition even suggests that his election was accepted and confirmed by Constantinople. If that is true, then Hilarion was not the leader of a rebellion. He was evidence that the Byzantine authorities could, under certain circumstances, accept a Russian candidate chosen in Russia. A century later, however, the case of Clement was very different. His appointment did not unfold in an atmosphere of compromise but in open conflict. Prince Iziaslav and the bishops who supported him moved forward without the Patriarch's approval, and this immediately divided the Russian Church. Some bishops accepted Clement. Others refused, insisting that without the blessing of Constantinople, his authority could not be recognized. What is striking is that even those who opposed him did not seem shocked that a Russian had been chosen by Russian bishops. Their objection was narrower and more precise. They argued that the Patriarch's confirmation was still necessary. That detail is extremely important. It suggests that the real dispute was not over whether a native candidate could be elected, but over whether the process could be completed without Constantinople. This distinction helps explain why the controversy became so bitter. Many Russian bishops clearly believed that local election was lawful. Some even believed local consecration was lawful as well. Others were willing to go only part of the way, accepting the right of election but insisting that consecration or final approval belonged to the Patriarch. The disagreement was not simply between patriots and loyalists. It was a struggle between different readings of church law, mixed with political tension and personal rivalry. Behind the argument stood a larger issue. How much freedom could the Russian Church claim while still remaining within the spiritual order of Eastern Christendom? The political climate of the 12th century made that question even sharper. Princes in Kiev were no longer dealing with Byzantium from a position of simple submission. They were increasingly aware that the Metropolitan could serve not only as a religious leader, but also as a channel of imperial influence. That fear appears very clearly in the stance of Prince Iziaslav. He saw the Patriarch's authority in Ruses not just as a matter of faith, but as a possible instrument of Byzantine interference. His push for a locally chosen Metropolitan was therefore both ecclesiastical and political. It was an attempt to protect the dignity of his realm and reduce outside pressure. In that sense, the struggle over church appointments became part of a wider struggle over sovereignty itself. The reaction that followed is just as revealing. After Iziaslav's death, new rulers reversed his policy and restored ties with Constantinople. Yet even then, the arguments did not disappear. The new disputes show that Russian princes still believed they had a right to be consulted before a metropolitan was imposed on them. Some were prepared to accept a patriarchal nominee only under protest, and only after securing recognition of their own political authority. This suggests that the balance between Kiev and Constantinople was constantly being renegotiated. The Patriarch could still claim supreme spiritual power, but Russian rulers increasingly insisted that their own voice mattered in the making of the church leadership. Taken together, these episodes force us to see the relationship in a different light. The story was not one of complete Greek control occasionally interrupted by rare outbursts of Russian resistance. It was a long, uneven negotiation. At times, Byzantium accepted local choices. At times, Russian rulers accepted the Patriarch's authority. At times, both sides pushed too far, and crisis followed. The central question was never simply whether the Russian Church belonged to Constantinople. Formally, it did. The deeper issue was how that dependence would work in practice, and how much room could be found for local ambition, local law, and local identity. In the end, the real fault line seems to have run through the act of consecration itself. Election was one thing, consecration was another. For Byzantium, the right to consecrate a metropolitan was a visible sign of jurisdiction and supremacy. To surrender that right would mean weakening the very bond that tied the Russian Church to Constantinople. For the Russians, however, the language of church law could be read in a way that allowed a much broader local role. That is why the arguments became so intense. They were not only debating a ritual step, they were debating who truly held authority in the Christian life of Rus. And from those arguments, we can already see the early shape of a larger historical movement. The gradual rise of a Russian church that remained orthodox, remained linked to Byzantium in tradition, but was more and more determined to define its own path. What this broader picture suggests is that Hilarion and Clement were probably not the only metropolitans shaped by Russian choice. Other church leaders may also have been selected first in Russes and only afterward confirmed in Constantinople. Some later evidence points to figures like Constantine, Theodore, Nicetas, and Matthew as men whose rise may have depended on Russian princes as much as on the Patriarch. Not every detail can be proven with certainty, but the pattern matters. It suggests that the leadership of the Russian Church was not always decided in a single direction, from Byzantium down to Kiev. In many cases, the process may have begun in Russia itself, with local rulers and bishops choosing the man they wanted and then sending him south for formal approval. That possibility changes the whole meaning of the relationship between Rus and Byzantium. For a long time, historians tended to imagine a system in which Constantinople simply selected one Greek churchman after another and placed him over the Russian Church with only a few rare exceptions. But the surviving evidence points to something more flexible. The Russian side seems to have believed that it had both the right and the precedent to put forward its own candidates. And the Byzantine side, despite its formal claims, often appears to have tolerated this when political conditions made compromise useful. In other words, this was not a rigid chain of command. It was a negotiated system, shaped by law, diplomacy, and necessity. By the 15th century, that memory was still alive. Russian rulers could still speak as if it had long been normal for the Church of Rus to receive its metropolitans, sometimes from Greece and sometimes from its own land. That tradition may not prove every case beyond doubt, but it shows how the past was understood inside the Russian world. To them, local participation in choosing the metropolitan was not some late invention. It was part of an older historical pattern, something rooted in the early life of their church. When all the pieces are brought together, a larger conclusion emerges. A Byzantine historian from the 14th century described an arrangement in which the leadership of the Russian Church alternated between Greek and Russian figures. Direct proof of a formal treaty is missing, but the surrounding evidence gives the idea real force. In the centuries after the Mongol invasion, the sequence of appointments follows that pattern with striking regularity. In the earlier Kievan age, the pattern is less clear, yet even there the evidence suggests that Russian rulers and bishops were not passive recipients of decisions made abroad. Again and again, they tried to shape the choice of their own metropolitan, and at least sometimes Constantinople seems to have accepted that reality. The legal background also helps explain why this was possible. Church law in the Eastern Christian world still preserved older ideas that gave local bishops an important role in elections. Even though the Byzantine Church had become more centralized over time, the older canons had never fully disappeared. That left room for argument. Russian churchmen could appeal to those traditions when they defended their right to choose their own leaders. Byzantine authorities, meanwhile, could insist on their own interpretation while still bending in practice whenever diplomacy required it. This created a system that was never entirely fixed. It could be strict in theory and flexible in reality. Politics pushed both sides toward compromise. Russian princes wanted influence over the head of their church because the metropolitan was too important to leave in foreign hands. He was not only a spiritual leader, he could shape alliances, support rival rulers, and strengthen or weaken princely power. Byzantine emperors understood this just as well. They saw the Metropolitan of Kiev as an important link between the empire and the Russian lands, someone who could help preserve Byzantine influence far beyond the empire's borders. Because Rus was powerful and valuable as an ally, Constantinople had good reason to avoid unnecessary conflict. Granting some room for local choice was often better than forcing obedience and risking alienation. That is why the most likely system was not a simple victory for one side over the other. When political circumstances required it, Russian rulers may have chosen the candidate they wanted. Constantinople would then preserve its dignity and formal authority by turning that choice into a canonical appointment through the patriarchal machinery. The Patriarchal Synod could carry out the official election, and the Patriarch could consecrate or confirm the man who had already been selected in practice. This allowed everyone to claim something. The Russians gained influence over the choice. Byzantium preserved the appearance and much of the substance of its supremacy. Seen in that light, the larger relationship between Byzantium and the Russian Church becomes much more subtle. It was not based only on domination, and not based only on resistance either. It worked through compromise. Byzantium held on to the language of universal authority, while Russia slowly expanded its role inside the system. The result was a long partnership marked by tension, bargaining, and adaptation. And if there really was an understanding that Greek and Russian metropolitans should alternate, then it would fit perfectly into this world of careful diplomacy, where imperial control and local ambition were constantly balanced against one another. Russia appeared to Byzantine observers as a land of immense scale and immense promise. In the middle of the 14th century, one writer in Constantinople described it as a country so vast that its full dimensions could scarcely be grasped, rich in harvests, silver, furs, and the resources of the northern seas. From the forests and cold plains came valuable animal pelts that were traded far beyond the Russian lands. From the waters nearby came fish and marine products prized by wealthy courts and refined elites. This image reveals more than simple curiosity. It shows that even after centuries of contact, Byzantium still looked north with intense interest, especially toward the raw materials and wealth that flowed from the regions beyond the Black Sea. Trade between the two worlds had suffered during the disruptions caused by the Mongol advance and the Latin seizure of Constantinople. Yet, by the 14th century, those connections had revived. Still, the terms had changed. The Genoese and Venetians now dominated Black Sea commerce, limiting how much direct benefit Byzantium could draw from this renewed exchange. Even so, grain and salted fish from the northern coast remained essential to the survival of Constantinople. When conflicts in the Black Sea disrupted this supply, shortages in the capital quickly became severe. Money from the Russian lands mattered just as much as material goods. By this stage, Byzantium was living through deep financial collapse. The state had been reduced to humiliating measures, pawning treasures and struggling even to preserve the outward dignity of imperial ceremony. In such conditions, outside support was no luxury. It was a necessity. When a powerful earthquake damaged Hagia Sophia in the 1400s, the ruler of Moscow sent a large sum to help restore the church. Later, while Constantinople was under Turkish pressure, more aid arrived from Moscow in the form of charitable relief for a city described in Russian memory as suffering want and misery. These donations did not appear out of nowhere. They were encouraged and arranged through the head of the Russian Church, who had been appointed under the authority of Constantinople, and was expected to defend not only the spiritual interests of orthodoxy, but also the broader needs of the empire. At one point, the Patriarch of Constantinople even urged the Russian metropolitan to raise more money, insisting that supporting the defense of the imperial capital was a holier act than many other forms of religious generosity. In that appeal, Constantinople was presented not as a distant foreign city, but as the pride, safeguard, and glory of Christians everywhere. Economic ties, however, tell only part of the story. By the second half of the 14th century, Byzantium had urgent political reasons to pay close attention to Russia. The empire was shrinking fast. The Ottoman Turks had crossed into Europe and, within a few decades, had overrun most of what remained of Byzantine power on the mainland. Bulgaria had fallen. Serbia had been broken. Aside from a few scattered territories, the empire was being compressed into Constantinople itself and a handful of surviving possessions. The Byzantine emperors searched desperately for military help. Appeals to Western Europe brought little real success. Diplomatic journeys to Italy, France, and England produced promises more often than results. Even major efforts to push the Turks back ended in failure. Under those circumstances, the changing political map of Eastern Europe became more important than ever. Around the year 1300, the Russian lands were still divided among many small principalities, all overshadowed by the formidable power of the Golden Horde. Over time, two major centers emerged as rivals for leadership among the Eastern Slavs. One was Lithuania, which expanded across large sections of western and southwestern Rus, and eventually took Kiev itself. The other was Moscow. Smaller at first, Moscow steadily developed the claim that it represented the true political and cultural heir of old Kievan Rus, the state that had once enjoyed especially close and profitable relations with Byzantium. The princes of Moscow were patient, disciplined, and relentless. They first advanced by carefully accommodating Mongol power, but with the backing of the church and their own elite supporters, they began gathering the Russian lands under their control. By the end of the 14th century, their strength had grown dramatically. One of the reasons for that rise was the widespread belief that only Moscow had the power to resist the Tatars and one day free the country. That belief gained enormous force after the victory at Kulikovo in 1380, when the forces of Prince Dmitry of Moscow defeated a large Tatar army. Although the triumph did not immediately end Mongol power and was followed by fresh devastation, its symbolic effect was enormous. Inside Russia and beyond it, Moscow's prestige rose sharply. The Byzantine government watched these developments closely. For centuries, the empire had paid special attention to the peoples living north of the Black Sea, since friendship or hostility in that region could shape the security of the empire itself. In earlier centuries, when Byzantine power was stronger, maintaining influence had been one of the great principles of imperial diplomacy. In the late medieval period, when Byzantium had become a weakened state struggling for survival, that goal became even more urgent and far more difficult. Yet Byzantium still possessed two powerful advantages. The first was the enduring prestige of Constantinople, which continued to dazzle the imagination of Eastern Christian peoples. The second was Orthodox Christianity itself, whose spiritual centre remained in the imperial city. Because military power was fading, Byzantium relied more and more on those two assets. In practical terms, this meant strengthening the authority of the Patriarchate over the churches of Eastern Europe, while also making careful concessions to local rulers and local religious sensitivities. In many cases, that required granting limited self-government to churches outside the empire, while trying to preserve their loyalty to Constantinople. This dual policy explains why church affairs stood at the heart of relations between Byzantium and the Russian world in the 14th and early 15th centuries. The most difficult issue was the leadership of the Russian Church. Until the Mongol invasions, its metropolitan had resided in Kiev and had been appointed by the Patriarch of Constantinople. As political conditions changed and northeastern Rus' rose in importance, the seat moved first to Vladimir and then to Moscow. Legally, the title remained the same. The Metropolitan was still called the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. In practice, though, the office increasingly became tied to the ambitions of Moscow. that naturally alarmed Moscow's rivals. If the metropolitan remained in Moscow, then the princes of that city enjoyed a huge political and moral advantage. Opponents in Galicia, Lithuania, and elsewhere tried repeatedly to persuade Constantinople to create separate metropolitanates within their own territories. These appeals often came with threats, pressure, or financial inducements, and the Byzantine authorities sometimes gave in. Separate church jurisdictions were created for Galicia or Lithuania, only to be abolished again a few years or decades later. These constant changes exposed a deeper weakness. Byzantium was being pushed and pulled by outside rulers who sought to use church organization for political ends. When separate metropolitanates were created, it showed how much pressure the empire could be forced to absorb. When those arrangements were later undone, it usually reflected concessions made to Moscow, which wanted one church structure that could still project influence beyond the borders of the Muscovite state. The Byzantine authorities generally preferred unity. Tradition favoured it. Administration favoured it. So did the empire's growing need for good relations with Moscow, whose political influence and material value were becoming harder to ignore. Closely tied to this struggle over church jurisdiction was another question just as important. Who had the right to choose the metropolitan? For Byzantium, the answer mattered because the metropolitan in Russia was more than a church leader. He was also a valuable diplomatic figure, someone who could help maintain Russian loyalty to the empire and to the Patriarchate. For the rulers of Moscow, the issue was equally obvious. Even if they accepted that the metropolitan would ultimately need approval and consecration from Constantinople, they wanted strong control over the choice itself. For a long time, this conflict was managed through compromise. Byzantine and Russian candidates seem to have alternated with notable regularity, suggesting that some understanding existed between both sides. But in the late medieval period, appointments to the metropolitan throne became one of the central battlegrounds in Russo-Byzantine relations. Behind the church language and ceremonial procedures lay a wider struggle involving diplomacy, power politics, competing visions of authority, and the slow formation of a new Russian political consciousness. All of these tensions can be seen in the appointment of Alexius in 1354. He was a Russian bishop chosen to become Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, and the official decree from Constantinople makes clear that the decision was heavily influenced by the wishes of the ruler of Moscow. At the same time, the same document tried to present the choice as unusual and risky, insisting that appointing a native Russian should not become a normal practice. The text is revealing. On one level, it shows a patriarchate trying to satisfy Moscow. On another, it reveals deep discomfort. The patriarch at the time, Philotheus, was committed to strengthening the authority of Constantinople across the Orthodox world. He had good reasons to keep Moscow friendly, especially at a moment when Byzantine political weakness was becoming painfully clear and when other Orthodox churches in the Balkans were slipping from his control. Yet accepting the demands of a secular ruler in such a matter also conflicted with his ecclesiastical ideals. He belonged to a current in the Byzantine Church that insisted church appointments should remain free from political interference. Granting this concession to Moscow forced him into a compromise he could hardly have welcomed. That tension may explain why the official language tried to blur the historical truth, pretending that Russian appointments were against long-standing custom, even though native Russians had already occupied the post before. The effort to prevent further Russian appointments failed almost immediately. After Alexius died, the Patriarchate agreed more than once to native candidates. Even before his death, the same Byzantine authorities had weakened his position by entertaining Lithuanian complaints against him and by appointing a rival figure, Cyprian, under conditions that openly threatened Alexius's authority. Later inquiries found the accusations against Alexius unconvincing, and his enormous popularity in Muscovy made it impossible to remove him. But the damage had been done. From the Russian point of view, Constantinople had humiliated a respected church leader and treated Moscow's religious life as a field for diplomatic maneuver. Anger spread widely. Even Byzantine sources noticed the uproar that followed. Cyprian himself later reported that the people of Muscovy were insulting not only the Patriarch, but also the Emperor and the Synod, accusing them of siding with Lithuania. This was not a minor irritation. It was a sign that confidence in Byzantine fairness was beginning to fray. An even more chaotic episode followed after Alexius's death. His intended successor, a Russian cleric chosen by the Grand Prince of Moscow and apparently accepted in advance, set out for Constantinople to receive consecration. Before reaching the city, he died unexpectedly. The men travelling with him then used pre-signed blank documents and money entrusted to them by the prince to put forward another candidate from their own group. With forged papers and, very likely, bribery, they secured his consecration in Constantinople. The whole affair was disgraceful. Russian envoys and Byzantine church officials both bore responsibility. The result was years of disorder in the Russian church and further bitterness in Moscow. Prince Dmitry, who had already seen Byzantine authorities manipulate church appointments in ways harmful to Muscovy, now had even more reason to distrust them. This pattern of suspicion would continue into the next generation. A particularly important turning point came during the reign of Basil I of Moscow. In the early 1390s, the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote to him in outrage after learning that the emperor's name had been removed from the commemorative prayers of the Russian Church. Basil had reportedly spoken dismissively of the emperor and had declared that Russia had the Church, but not the emperor. To the Patriarch, that was not merely disrespectful. It was a profound challenge to the entire Byzantine understanding of Christian order. In reply, he laid out with striking force the old Byzantine doctrine of empire. The emperor, he argued, was no ordinary ruler among many others. He was the anointed ruler of the Romans, and in a deeper spiritual sense, the ruler of all Christians. Other kings governed local territories. The Byzantine emperor alone held a unique universal dignity. The church and the empire, in this vision, were bound together so closely that separating them was impossible. To reject the emperor while accepting the patriarch was, in Byzantine eyes, a contradiction. This letter remains one of the clearest expressions of the Byzantine idea of universal empire. What makes it even more powerful is the setting in which it was written. A city already under grave threat, clinging to a political theology that outlived the actual strength of the state that proclaimed it. What Basil's defiance really meant is a difficult question. Direct evidence from medieval Russia is limited, but earlier and later hints suggest that Russian rulers generally did accept, at least in broad terms, the special status of the Byzantine emperor as the supreme head of the Christian Commonwealth. There are signs that some Russian princes accepted honorary titles from Byzantium and addressed the emperor with marked deference. In one case, a Russian ruler is represented as acknowledging that both imperial law and the Great Church of Constantinople were sources of religious and legal order. Even on the eve of Byzantium's fall, the ruler of Moscow still addressed the emperor in language that implied a recognized duty to support Orthodox Christians beyond his own realm. None of this means that Russian princes considered themselves political dependents in any modern sense. They certainly would not have allowed direct imperial intervention in their internal government, except perhaps in church matters. Their subordination to the Khans of the Golden Horde was concrete and coercive in a way their relationship to Byzantium never was. But throughout most of the medieval period, Russia still seems to have accepted, at least tacitly, that the Byzantine emperor held a divinely sanctioned place above all Christian rulers. In that sense, the Russian lands belong not to an empire of direct control, but to a wider sacred order centered on Constantinople. Basil's gesture, then, was unusual rather than typical. It seems not to have become a lasting rebellion. Before long, the emperor's name was probably restored to church usage, and Moscow later sent more money to assist Constantinople in time of need. As long as the imperial capital remained in Christian hands, Russian rulers do not appear to have openly challenged again the old hierarchy of the Orthodox world in quite the same way. Still, the incident exposed an important tension. Russia's attitude toward Byzantium was never simple. Admiration and resentment existed side by side. Russian memory preserved stories of successful wars against Byzantium from earlier centuries and took pride in them. The repeated conflict over native church leaders produced lasting frustration. Russians disliked the arrogance of patriarchs who insisted on choosing their own candidates when the empire was strong, and they also despised the ease with which Byzantine authorities could be bent by pressure, bribery, or convenience when the empire was weak. Byzantine diplomacy, skillful and often self-interested, left many Russians with the impression that Greek officials were clever manipulators, overly attached to money. Such judgments circulated widely and helped shape a durable stereotype. And yet, none of this bitterness could erase the far deeper pull of Byzantine civilization. In religion, law, literature, art, and political imagination, Russia had been formed in the shadow of East Rome. Even after the Mongol invasions had disrupted those connections, Byzantine cultural influence revived strongly in the 14th and early 15th centuries. The great painter Theophanes, active in Novgorod and later in Moscow, is one of the clearest symbols of this continued artistic bond. The loyalty of Russians to the Patriarchate of Constantinople remained real and deeply rooted. Until the crisis of the 15th century, there was no serious desire to break canonical ties with the Mother Church. In many ways, that loyalty had good foundations. Many Byzantine metropolitans in Russia were energetic and respectable figures. The emperors and patriarchs often did care sincerely about the flourishing of Christianity in the Russian lands. Russian monastic life, especially under the influence of major spiritual leaders and in close contact with the contemplative traditions of the Byzantine world, was undergoing an impressive renewal. Above all, there was Constantinople itself. For medieval Russians, the city was not simply a capital. It was a sacred place, a wonder of the Christian world, a city filled with holy power. Its churches, relics, monasteries, and liturgical life gave it an aura that rivaled Jerusalem itself. Russian travelers who visited the city wrote of it with awe, marveling at the abundance of sacred objects and the splendor of places like Hagia Sophia. Some descriptions echo the famous story of Prince Vladimir's envoys who, after witnessing worship there, felt they had entered something beyond earthly beauty. In Russian imagination, Constantinople was the imperial city, radiant with holiness and mystery. That vision, however, was shattered by the Council of Florence in 1439. The agreement of union between the Greek and Latin churches was a momentous event for all Christendom, but its long-term consequences were especially profound in Russia. A Russian delegation attended the council, led by Isidore, the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. He signed the union. When he returned to Moscow, now openly associated with the Roman Church, the reaction was immediate and fierce. His actions were seen as betrayal. He was deposed, arrested, and confined, though he later escaped abroad. With that, Muscovy rejected the union outright. In the years that followed, several Russian texts were written about the council. Their historical value is limited, since they are deeply partisan and often crude in argument. but their importance lies elsewhere. They helped create a lasting narrative, a new interpretation of Byzantium's failure and Russia's role in Christian history. According to this emerging story, the Greeks had betrayed orthodoxy by yielding to Rome. The emperor and patriarch had fallen into error. Greed and bribery were presented as central causes of their collapse. Russia, by contrast, had remained faithful. Basil II of Moscow was praised as the ruler who unmasked falsehood and preserved the true religion of his ancestors. The contrast could not have been sharper. Where Byzantium had fallen, Moscow had stood firm. Where the Greeks had traded truth for compromise, Russia had guarded the faith. That reversal marked a historic change. The old relationship between teacher and pupil was being turned upside down. Moscow was beginning to imagine itself not as a distant member of a world centered on Constantinople, but as the new heart of orthodoxy. The language used in Russian writings from this period already hints at that transformation. The Muscovite ruler is described in exalted terms. Russia is portrayed as divinely illuminated. The universal mission once associated with the empire begins to migrate northward in the imagination of Russian churchmen and political thinkers. This idea was still taking shape, and its full consequences had not yet been drawn. But the direction was unmistakable. During the years between Isidore's fall and the final fall of Constantinople in 1453, Muscovy was starting to redefine its place in the Christian world. For the rulers and churchmen of Moscow, the Union of Florence was not a distant theological dispute. It was a profound shock. For centuries, they had looked to Constantinople as the spiritual centre of the Orthodox world. Their loyalty to the Patriarchate had survived wars, political disputes, and repeated tensions over church appointments. That long habit of obedience made the events of Florence all the more disturbing. Suddenly, the highest authorities of Byzantium appeared to have accepted an agreement with the Latin Church that Muscovy had no intention of accepting. In Russian eyes, the emperor had failed and the patriarch had failed with him. A formula would soon emerge in Moscow that captured the depth of this disappointment with brutal simplicity. The emperor was no longer right, and the patriarch was no longer right. This was not just disapproval. It was the collapse of a moral certainty that had shaped Russian religious life for generations. The crisis became even more urgent because the Russian Church immediately faced a practical problem. Isidore, who had supported the union, could no longer remain acceptable in Moscow. A new metropolitan had to be chosen. That meant that the old and deeply sensitive question of who had the authority to appoint the head of the Russian Church returned once again to the centre of relations between Muscovy and Byzantium. After Isidore fled Moscow in 1441, the Russians found themselves facing three possible paths. They could openly break with the Patriarch in Constantinople by declaring him a heretic for accepting union with Rome and then proceed to elect their own church leader. They could choose a new metropolitan on their own without formally denouncing the Patriarch, while hoping that Constantinople might later approve the choice. Or they could wait, avoid a direct confrontation, pretend for the moment that the union had changed nothing, and seek permission from Constantinople to elect and consecrate a metropolitan in Russia itself, trusting that anti-union forces in Byzantium might soon reverse the whole settlement. The first option was too drastic for the Muscovite world. Russian churchmen were conservative by instinct, cautious in matters of canon law, and deeply shaped by the idea that their church belonged within the wider Orthodox order centered on Constantinople. There is no sign that they seriously wanted a sudden and total break at that stage. Instead, they chose first to stall and maneuver, and then later move toward acting on their own while still trying to preserve the appearance of loyalty. In 1441, Basil II sent a letter to the Patriarch that reveals just how careful Moscow still was. The tone remained respectful. The Patriarch was addressed as the supreme religious authority of Orthodox Christendom. Isidore was accused of betrayal. Basil also reminded Constantinople that when Isidore had first been appointed, the Muscovite side had preferred another candidate, the Russian bishop Jonah. From there, the Grand Prince moved to his real request. He asked that Russia be allowed to elect its own metropolitan through a council of native bishops. The argument was made with great tact. He avoided naming Jonah directly as the intended candidate. Instead, he appealed to practical necessity, the authority of church law, the danger of long travel between Moscow and Constantinople, the instability of the lands lying in between, and even the risks created when state matters had to be discussed through interpreters, if the metropolitan happened to be Greek. He ended by stressing that Russia wished to preserve the traditional bond with the emperor and to remain obedient to the Patriarch in spiritual matters. It is not even certain that this letter ever reached its destination. What is clear is that no immediate solution followed. For several years, Russia remained without a metropolitan. Basil II had problems of his own. Civil war weakened Muscovy, and for a time he even fell into Tatar captivity. The church question remained unresolved until the end of 1448, when a council of Russian bishops assembled under the authority of Basil elected Jonah of Ryazan as metropolitan of all Rus. This was a decisive step. Whatever careful language Moscow continued to use, Jonah's election without approval from Constantinople was a direct challenge to patriarchal authority. It marked the point at which the Russian Church, in practice, began to govern itself. Even then, the move caused deep anxiety in Moscow. Not everyone agreed that Jonah's elevation had been lawful. Some influential voices believed it violated canonical order. The Russian authorities understood perfectly well how serious their action was, and for years they waited in tense silence to see how Byzantium would respond. Finally, in 1452, Basil made one more effort to explain himself. He addressed a new letter to Emperor Constantine XI. The tone was still respectful, even ceremonious. Basil went so far as to acknowledge that the emperor retained certain prerogatives in Russia because of his sacred office. But something had changed beneath the diplomatic surface. The letter defended Moscow's actions as an unavoidable necessity, rather than an act of defiance. It also hinted, carefully but unmistakably, that many people in Byzantium itself still rejected the union with Rome. In effect, Basil argued that Russia had not acted out of pride. It had acted to preserve the ancient Orthodox faith inherited from Byzantium itself. The Russian Church, he insisted, still sought the blessing and spiritual connection of the great Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. It wished to remain joined to that tradition in all things except the recent and troubling disputes that had arisen. This was a final attempt to preserve two positions that no longer fit together. Moscow wanted to keep its loyalty to the spiritual inheritance of Constantinople, while no longer accepting practical dependence on a patriarch compromised by union with Rome. For a brief moment, that balancing act still seemed possible. Then, history overtook the argument. In April 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. On the 29th of May, the city fell. With that, the whole landscape changed. The union accepted at Florence collapsed together with the empire that had tried to enforce it. The Church of Constantinople returned to orthodoxy, but the old order could not be restored. Basil's last letter remained unsent in the archives of Muscovy. The theological problem had vanished. The Patriarch was no longer compromised by union. But a new obstacle had appeared, one that would prove even more decisive in the eyes of Muscovite rulers. Constantinople was now under Muslim rule. Its patriarch would live under Ottoman power and receive his position with the approval of the Sultan. For Moscow, that political reality made a return to earlier dependence unthinkable. As a result, the autonomous position that the Russian Church had taken for itself in 1448 remained in place. At first, this independence existed in practice more than in formal theory. But over time, it hardened into accepted reality. Much later, with the agreement of the wider Orthodox world, that arrangement would be transformed into a fully recognized patriarchate. The roots of that outcome lay in the crisis triggered by Florence, the rejection of Isidore, and the decision to consecrate Jonah without waiting for Constantinople. At the end of this long story, the same dual attitude toward Byzantium can still be seen in Russian thought. Moscow distrusted Byzantine diplomacy, and often detested the methods by which the empire tried to guide Russian church affairs. Yet it remained ready, again and again, to help the sacred city of Constantinople in times of danger. Russian rulers resented imperial interference in ecclesiastical matters, but they still showed willingness to acknowledge the emperor's special place in the Christian world. They fought stubbornly for political independence, yet they continued to seek the spiritual authority, artistic brilliance, and cultural prestige that flowed from Byzantine civilization. They were appalled by what they saw as the Greek willingness at Florence to compromise the Orthodox faith in exchange for political survival. Yet even then, they hesitated to sever canonical ties with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Attraction and resistance remained locked together. Medieval Russia's image of Byzantium was never simple. It was built on reverence and suspicion at the same time. But by the 15th century, that unstable balance could no longer hold. The Russian view of Byzantium was being reshaped by two great shocks that changed the entire mental world of Muscovy. The first was the Union of Florence. The second was the fall of Constantinople. These events did not merely produce temporary anger or grief. They forced Russians to rethink who now stood at the center of orthodoxy and who still had the right to lead the Christian world. The effect was not immediate in every detail, it unfolded over decades. But it was decisive. The first response to Florence was confusion and alarm. Only gradually did a new interpretation begin to spread within official circles in Moscow. According to that interpretation, the Greeks had forfeited their authority by entering into union with the Latins. They had ceased to be the trustworthy guardians of orthodoxy. The fall of Constantinople intensified this line of thinking even more, but it also produced a second and more emotional reaction. Some Muscovite churchmen explained the catastrophe as divine punishment. In their view, the imperial city had stood secure as long as it remained faithful to orthodoxy, and it fell only after departing from that truth. This argument appeared in the writings of Metropolitan Jonah and others close to the Muscovite court. The meaning was clear. The Greeks had betrayed the faith, and God had judged them. Yet this official interpretation did not fully match the spontaneous response of Russian society. The immediate emotional reaction in Russia to the fall of Constantinople seems to have been horror, grief, and pity. The destruction of the Christian empire was not felt as a distant political event. It was experienced as a spiritual catastrophe of enormous scale. The loss of a city that had stood for 1,000 years, the desecration of Hagia Sophia, the suffering of the Byzantines, and the collapse of what had long seemed the central stronghold of Christian civilization, all created the sense that the world itself had entered a dark and frightening new age. The disaster invited comparison with the great calamities of sacred history. It seemed to some as though the end of the world might not be far off. This mood can be seen clearly in the laments and narratives that circulated in Muscovy soon after the fall. One moving Byzantine lament on the capture of the city was translated into Russian not long afterward, and became part of Muscovite literature. It mourned Constantinople as the glory long desired by all, the support of an entire people, and the brilliance of the inhabited world. It spoke of Hagia Sophia as a heaven on earth, a second paradise. It wept for the destruction of schools, libraries, sanctuaries, and homes. It described the citizens of the city as a holy people driven into exile and scattered in misery. The voice of the lament was one of stunned grief. It reached for the most terrible parallels imaginable: the destruction of Jerusalem, the agony of the crucifixion, the signs of the final days. That such a text was embraced in Muscovy shows that Russian responses to the fall of Byzantium were not limited to cold political interpretation. They were also deeply emotional, even apocalyptic. These two reactions, one national and the other apocalyptic, continued side by side in Russian writing during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The first interpreted events in terms of providential transfer. Byzantium had failed, Moscow had remained faithful, and therefore the centre of orthodoxy had passed northward. The second saw the fall of Constantinople as a terrifying rupture in sacred history, an event so overwhelming that it could only be understood in the language of cosmic disaster. Both responses appeared in Russian historical writing, religious reflection, and political thought. Sometimes they existed together without clear conflict. Over time, however, the national interpretation proved stronger. As Muscovy grew more powerful, more centralized, and more conscious of its own destiny, the older emotional dependence on Byzantium began to fade. The immediate shock of Constantinople's fall gradually weakened. In its place came a new confidence. Russian thinkers became more willing to imagine their own land not as a distant disciple of a fallen empire, but as the chief guardian of the true faith. Out of this shift came the tradition that would later present Moscow as the Third Rome. That idea did not appear all at once in finished form. It grew from the combination of events that had shattered the old world: the union with Rome, the collapse of Byzantium, and the conviction that Russia alone had preserved orthodoxy without compromise. By the 16th century, fewer and fewer Russians could still look back toward Byzantium with the older sense of longing and dependence. The ecumenical vision once centered on Constantinople had given way to something more enclosed, more self-assured, and more national. The broad horizons of the Byzantine world, with its claim to universal Christian order, were replaced in Muscovy by a firmer belief in Russia's own unique role. Byzantium was not forgotten. Its religion, culture, symbols, and prestige still shaped Russian identity at the deepest level. But the emotional relationship had changed forever. What had once been reverence toward a living center became inheritance from a fallen one.